Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LEC versus Primer and Power Rankings video. The LEC Winter Split is upon us. We have a new 2026 season to talk about and to get excited for, and specifically we've got some LEC roster changes that are very intriguing to go over. The league is starting anew in just a couple of days, and I, for one, could not be more excited. Are you guys excited? Let me know down in the comment section below. Let me know what you expect to happen from the LEC this year. What teams do you think are going to do well? What teams do you think are not going to do well? Who do you want to cheer for? What teams are you kind of interested in watching? Maybe that you didn't expect to be interested in. Maybe organizations that aren't normally as, fun to speculate about. I'd love to know who is kind of catching you guys' eye. But of course, I'm going to be going over everything in today's video. This is the Primer and Power Rankings video for the LEC. We've already posted this same exact video for the LPL a couple of days ago, and then the LCK earlier this week. So this will be our third of four. The LCS will be coming out next week because they start a week later than everybody else, but trust me, it is right around the corner. And you know what? No LCS talk today. It is all about the LEC. So, I don't want to waste you guys' time too much. There is a ton to go over in terms of talking about the preamble of this video, what you're going to be seeing throughout this, entire podcast that's posted here to YouTube, and just generally what my thoughts and opinions are. I have to contextualize everything that you are going to see. First and foremost, if you're new to the channel, hello. Like I said, we've been posting about the LEC every single game since 2022, but I've been covering this league and many others for much longer for various websites, tracking statistics, and so I definitely have a pretty good breadth of knowledge on not only the LEC, but a lot of the players that are coming through, even from Tier 2 as well. What this video specifically is going to be is a Primer and Power Rankings video. We're going to go from number 12 to number 1 in my personal Power Rankings, talking about each of these teams and my expectations for them. This is not necessarily like an organization grade video. We did something very similar to that in my off-season grades that we posted about a month ago. You can check that video out on this channel as well, where we went over every single team's off-season, and I talked about whether or not I thought they were moving in the right or wrong direction, whether I liked the moves or not. That's not necessarily what this video in particular is going to be about. This is going to be much more small-minded, I guess, a little picture, if you really want to put it that way. This is going to be analyzing who I think will be good in the Winter Split. Who do I think has a good chance of representing the region at first stand, and who do I think might struggle a little bit more than the rest? Like I said, we're going from number 12 to number 1 in my power rankings, but the main thing to point out here is that this is, for the most part, a floor ranking, and we'll talk about this as well. We're not just ranking the teams, we're ranking every single player from number 1 to number 12 in their own individual position in that same way. And when I say floor rankings, I really mean floor rankings. These are, quite similar chaotic teams in terms of a lot of different things. I think that there are a lot of ways you could put one team above the other or something like that. This is me ranking them in order of how confident I am that they are going to be competitive in 2026. It's not necessarily guaranteeing that this is going to be what the standings look like throughout the entirety of the year, because I'm sure there's going to be a team that overperforms. I'm sure there will be a team that underperforms, especially in the LEC. This is basically the one I get, I don't want to say the worst, but I certainly take the most risks in this video every single year in the power ranking segment, because all of these teams are just so close in terms of skill level, and so there's just a lot of room for variance. There are going to be a lot of teams that are closer to 500. Not a lot of teams are going to be dominating and, going undefeated, and, even less are going to be winless. It's just kind of generally how the LEC has always gone. We'll be kind of breaking them into tiers. In this video specifically, we're going to be going from A to F tier, kind of talking about teams that I think fit and what those qualifications are for each tier, but we'll get to that when we get to those specific tiers. The main caveat that I have to point out at the beginning of these videos, because, it's just kind of the main thing you have to say when you give your opinion here on the internet. This is just my opinion. There are going to be a lot of things in this video that you disagree with. I promise you. If you are watching going, oh, I'm going to check out his video and see if his opinion matches up with mine, it almost certainly doesn't. In fact, I've generated a bit of a reputation, especially in the LEC community on this channel, for going against the grain, going against consensus, and maybe being a little bit higher or a little bit lower on certain players and certain teams and certain play styles and all of that stuff. If you are somebody that really gets frustrated by hearing opinions that aren't your own, this might not be the video for you, but I'm definitely going to be sharing a lot of my opinions here. If you have something you disagree with majorly, that is awesome. Let me know down in the comment section below. Why do you think I'm stupid for having that opinion, and what would you put, a player above or a player below? If you think a player is ranked too low or a team is ranked too low, what teams or players do you think they should be ranked above? This is, of course, a zero-sum ranking, so if a player wants to move up on this list, you got to tell me who they are better than that is above them. them, but always love hearing feedback from you guys, even if those opinions aren't necessarily the same as my own. But that's the biggest major caveat. You know, like I said, we're going to be ranking these in terms of tiers. This scale is generally intended to be as flexible as possible, which means that if you have a player at like number 7 in their position and I have them at number 5 or number 9 or something like that, we're probably not all that far off in terms of what our opinion is of that player. We're probably in a pretty similar spot with how we feel about them. It's just the way that this scale works. Don't get too in the weeds in terms of seeing a player like one spot above or below where you would personally put them. Now, if you have a major discrepancy, like I said, I'd love to hear that down in the comments, but it's not intended to be rigid. A lot of these players have almost identical grades for me. I just kind of needed to take a little bit of a punt on who to put 5 or who to put 6 in specific positions, if that makes sense. On top of that, we'll talk about this a bit more when we get the actual images up on the screen, but not every position is created equally. I have to talk about this in every video, even though this should be obvious. Some positions are just better than others. They have more deeper talent pools. They have better top-end talent. You know, something like support here in the LEC is incredibly top-heavy in terms of the amount of good players. Like the B caliber players in most other positions are going to be hovering around number 4 or number 5. Like a B caliber support would be number 6 or number 7 because there's so many really good supports in the LEC. That's not going to be the case for every single position. Again, some are just created better than others. That means that if you see 2 players on the same team and they're both ranked number 8, it's not because they always have the same exact grade. It's more so just because those positions might not always have the same amount of talent down the list. Again, that should be pretty self-explanatory, pretty obvious, but I do almost always get comments about it in these off-season videos, so I do want to make sure I specify that. Those are the major things to get out of the way. Without further ado, let's lock in and let's get into this video. This is going to be a long one. It's 12 teams to go over instead of 10 normally here for the LEC because we have the 2 provisional teams coming up from Tier 2 from EMEA Masters last year, and you know, just kind of representing Tier 2 on a big stage, seeing if they can live up to that. So we have 2 extra teams to talk about, and that means this is going to be a long one. Strap in. It's a podcast. This is going to be almost 2 hours, if not more than 2 hours. I wouldn't be surprised if it ended up reaching more than that, but the only way to start is by starting at the bottom. Like I said, we're going from number 12 to number 1 in my power rankings, and we're going to be starting in that F tier that I talked about, and unfortunately, there really is only one team in F tier. F tier to me is a team that I just don't believe will be competitive in Winter Split. I do not think has the tools or the resources. I think is significantly below every other team in the LEC in terms of my expectations, and I would expect most people are putting this team at number 12. It's K Corp Blue for me coming in at 12. Unfortunately, one of those provisional EMEA Masters teams. In fact, it's the defending champions from EMEA Masters in summer, and this is an unfortunate place for them to land, but for all of the K-Corp fans out there, trust me, it's not the last time you'll be hearing about K-Corp in this video, as you guys can expect. I just don't really think their B team stands a big chance right now in the LEC, as you can see from some of these player grades. Most of these guys weren't even playing in Tier 2 last year. I shouldn't say most. You know, technically, I guess only 2 of them played in Tier 2. One of them was in Tier 1, though, so it doesn't necessarily feel like it accentuates my point, but there are multiple players on this team that were playing in Tier 3 in LFL 2 last year for K-Corp. So it just ends up being kind of a hard team to evaluate, and a team that you have to consider the lowest floor in the entire league. There is a real shot that these players just aren't good enough to compete at the Tier 1 level right now, and in fact, that's kind of what I'm expecting. We'll talk a bit about what you're seeing on your screen. This is going to change once we get out of these provisional spots and we start talking about teams that actually did have LEC teams last year, because there are going to be some comparison grades that we'll talk about, and those familiar with my other regions will already recognize kind of what I'm referring to there. But the main things you're going to see on your screen, the team name, of course, at the top, and then where I personally power rank them from number 1 to 12. The 12 next to K-Corp Blue signifies they're number 12 in the power rankings. You can see how they finished domestically in their summer split. In K-Corp's case, it's in the LFL. They went 6-3, and they, of course, won the LFL summer playoffs, and then how they did at EMEA Masters, and that was first place. They ended up winning that tournament. They won the Tier 2 tournament for EU. So obviously, that's a great result, and you know, we'll talk about why that would have been really cool to see that team, you know, get run back here in the LEC, but it's just not necessarily going to be the case. You can see all 5 of the starting members of this team near the bottom of the screen. Any number below them will just signify where I'm ranking them out of 12 in their position in the LEC. Any sort of marks or especially asterisks next to a player's name, like there is for Yukino on this particular sheet, would just denote that they are taking up an import slot, and that is something to at the very least keep in mind. But for K-Corp Blue in particular, there's obviously a lot to talk about. There are quite a few players that have had no experience, even even close to tier 1 here. You're talking about a top laner and an AD carry that are coming up from tier 3. You're talking about a mid laner who was a bottom tier player on a tier 1 roster last year. You're talking about, you know, a jungler and a support that have been good at the tier 2 level, Yukino especially, which we will talk about, but have not necessarily shown the ability to be the best player on a tier 1 team like they're probably going to have to be here. It's just a lot to ask from a team that I think has a very, very low floor. So we'll talk about it here. Their lineup is looking like Tao in the top lane, Yukino in the jungle, Kamalu in the mid lane, Hazel at AD carry, and Prime at support. By the way, if it's not Tao, if it's actually like Teo or something, let me know. It did seem like in their roster announcement video, they called him Tao. I haven't really been able to find a ton of like English commentary for LFL2. As you guys know, it's a little bit difficult to, you know, get tape on tier 3 in a lot of instances, especially in regions that you are not a part of. VPNs are your best friends. So if I mispronounce Tao, or if it's not actually Hazel, if it's Hazel or something like that, just let me know down in the comments. I'd be happy to fix up any pronunciation errors. But when you have to talk about KOI Blue and what their actual chances are in Winter Split, you basically have to start with the middle of the map, because those are the only two players that I think really have any chance of being competitive at this level. Yukino and Kamalu. The problem here, right, is I like Yukino. I like him a lot. Obviously, North American player, came over, you know, looked really good for KOI Blue last year, had a lot of offers to go back to tier 1, but ended up choosing to stick around in this organization because he feels like he has a future here in Europe, which is great. I think he should. He's a really interesting player, and I think he took a lot of steps forward last year when he came over to Europe from North America, where it felt like he was stagnating for so many years. But he's going to almost certainly have to be the best player on this team from day number 1 for them to have any chance of being competitive with any other tier 1 roster, and that's just a lot to ask for a player in Yukino that I think is still inconsistent. I talked about this a lot when we would cover the NACL every single week on this channel, but this is a very carry-oriented player that plays really well when things are going in his favor, and if he has losing lanes and doesn't really have a ton of pressure on the map, he will flip games like for the negative. That's always been a bit of a problem for Yukino. Again, I think he cleaned that up quite a bit last year, but it certainly wasn't consistent, and honestly, he has to be the best player on this team. I don't really think there's another option. Potentially Kamalu could fill that spot. He is the only player on this team who has ever played in tier 1 before. I don't believe Yukino ever got any time anywhere in North America with a tier 1 spot. Kamalu, of course, the starting mid laner last year for Team Heretics, and has been on that organization for a little bit of time since they plucked him out of tier 3 a couple of years ago, and I think he's a great example of why I'm just not super high on the rest of this roster. It is really, really tough to make the leap from tier 3 to tier 1 without going through a lot of the middle processes. There have been multiple players here in Europe that have made that jump, and teams kind of have felt a little bit more willing to, you know, go out and get LFL2 kind of players, but Kamalu, I think, is, you know, an example of he was not ready. He was nowhere close to being ready. He was getting absolutely destroyed in lane, and then when he wasn't getting destroyed in lane, he looked okay, but the barrier of entry check was not being passed by Kamalu for a very long time. Even last year, it really did feel like he just was not settled in. He never really felt particularly comfortable at the end of the year in summer. He was just kind of a weak mid laner. He was the weakest player on a Team Heretics team that was bottom 3, bottom 4 throughout basically all of last year, and that's with other players on the team, I think, overperforming their own expectations. Sheo was great. I think Carlson was a lot better than we expected. Stend was really, really good, and Kamalu still was a pretty massive problem for that team. And again, he might have to be the best player on this team, and that is a very scary proposition. Yes, he's the only player with actual tier 1 experience, but that tier 1 experience has been him being a weak link on a team that's just barely trying to make playoffs. It just doesn't inspire a lot of confidence for me, and he comes in as my last ranked mid laner. I think every other mid laner in the region, in tier 1 right now, in the LEC, is better than Kamalu. I think obviously Heretics moving on was the right decision. Hopefully he can continue to develop. I think he was put in a really bad spot and asked to do too much early, but it's just really hard to predict that he's going to be able to live up to that. But Yukino and Kamalu are probably going to have to be the carries on this team because everybody else is just a massive question mark. You have Hazel and Prime on the bottom side. I feel a little bit better about these two. We'll talk about Tao in a second because he's fine. It's really, really hard to get an opinion of him, but Hazel and Prime are an interesting duo. Prime, a player that I actually had a lot of experience scouting because of last year, having to watch Han Sam D and try to get tape on him as he, you know, came back up to Navi. I came away with the conclusion of, oh, his teammates were actually really helping him out a lot. He wasn't really enabling a lot of himself, and then, you know, he was kind of getting pushed forward with resources to be able to fight in the late game. Prime was a big reason why I think Sam D ended up looking so good on that Karmine Corp team, and That does fill me with some sort of confidence that he could come up to tier 1 and at least be a competent kind of support. The problem is I do think his performances fell off quite a bit after Sam D left and when LPL Corp just wasn't very good in the summer split, and which makes it a lot more difficult to try and analyze what he is as of now. But quite frankly, from my own personal evaluations, he'll be competing to be the second best player on this team behind Yukino. You know, him and Kamalu I think would be coming from relatively similar points in my grading scale, and that's just not a good feeling when you are a team that's like hoping and praying to not be bottom 1 when potentially your second best player was on a non-playoff LFL team last year. Again, it's just a really hard sell. He comes in as my number 12 support. Everybody else has at least proven something at the tier 1 level. Prime has not been able to do that, and Hazel is one of 2 players coming up from tier 3. I will say again, I think Hazel is definitely a little bit more proven to me than someone like Tao is on the top side, but Hazel's just kind of your stock standard ADC right now. He's got good mechanics, and I think he understands the game well, but he doesn't really seem to have like a killer instinct, and he wasn't very dominant in tier 3, and that's just a very scary proposition. Like, if Prime is going to be one of your strongest players, you're hoping that that can translate into getting Hazel into good spots, but I don't know if Hazel is going to be able to win you a single game in tier 1 if you do give him the resources. It's just such a major unknown, and it's the same thing for Tao on the top side. Definitely more of an aggressive top laner. We see that a lot more commonly in Europe than we do in other regions. He'll play weak side. He can play weak side if he needs to, but certainly somebody who got the opportunity to carry quite a bit in tier 3 last year. I do not think he's going to have that same opportunity in tier 1. I think he's going to be given a lot of very safe lanes, and I think this team in general is probably just going to want to scale as much as possible. Kamalu needs to win in the early game in order to have any sort of impact on the later part of the game, which means that I expect the playstyle for KCB to be Prime moving around the map on more playmaking style supports and just kind of not trying to isolate themselves in these 2v2s. Him and Yukino are probably going to link up a lot, and then most likely are going to play for mid lane, the only player with actual experience at this level. I just don't think that that will work. I think there are more talented teams everywhere else. Maybe this team surprises me and actually does really well. I think it's totally possible that there is a skill set in here that would translate to something that is not bottom 1, but in terms of a prediction, in terms of like throwing out what a team's floor looks like, you would be insane to put this team anywhere other than number 12 in the power rankings, in my opinion. I don't think there's any argument. They're a full tier below everybody else in terms of what their floor could be, because you're looking at a bunch of players that have proven absolutely nothing at the tier 1 level, and they're going to be asked to all step up and perform well basically from day number 1. I don't think it will happen. I think they'll probably be competitive in a lot of these games, maybe hold on in the early game and then just kind of fall in the later parts, but I would really, really be surprised, more so than any other team in this list, if K-Corp Blue was actually competitive in the winter split. But that's going to bring us to number 11 in my power rankings. And boy, this one is going to make people really, really mad. And I had no clue where this team was going to come in when I was doing my off-season grades video, even really before I sat down to fully coordinate and write out the script for this one. I had no clue where this team was going to come in. And unfortunately, they come in pretty low because this is a floor ranking. It's Los Ratones coming in at number 11, and the comment section has already blown up. I imagine this will be one of my most commented on videos regardless of where I put this team, just because they have such a vibrant fan base, and you know, a lot of things grow in views when Los Ratones is involved. I promise I'm not just doing this so that people comment on the video and boost the algorithm rate, although the mad fans I'm sure are really helping me in the algorithm right now. I really do think it's hard to say that this team's floor is higher than a lot of the other teams here. I think what we saw out of them most recently, and I know that there are some caveats, but what we saw out of them most recently at EMEA Masters Summer, where they got 3rd place, was not great. I think that there are some real concerns with a couple of players being able to translate their skill set to tier 1. You know, really only one player having a bit of a problem, and it's maybe not the one that you would expect me to talk about. Generally speaking, I think this team is good, and I certainly think they're a tier above, and that's where we're jumping up to like the D tier as opposed to the F tier. These are teams that I think could theoretically break through, but have some pretty major question marks and are kind of relying on some players that I think might have some problems. But I really do think it's a pretty low floor right now for Los Ratones. I think they could be as high as number 5 and as low as number like 11 on this list, just kind of wherever you wanted to put them, just how much faith you want to have that what we saw out of them most recently in the summer split, at least in terms of a real competitive tournament, was real versus, you know, what we saw out of them at the beginning of the year. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Baus in the top lane, Velia in the jungle, Nemesis in the mid lane, Crowny at AD carry, and Reckless at support. There are really good pieces on this team, and you know what? I'm going to get get to the controversial stuff out of the way. First and foremost, if you have never tuned in, and that's why I did a big preamble at the beginning of this, because I assume there will be quite a few people, you know, Los Ratones fans that maybe have not watched my content before. I generally tend to be a little bit more like prove it on this channel for, you know, tier 2 players, and that's really only going to apply to Velia here. Nemesis, Crowny, Reckless, they obviously have a ton of experience at the tier 1 level. Even Baus, I think you can generally know what you're getting, but even just starting with the biggest question mark for me, I really don't see a lot on tape that convinces me that Velia will make the transition easy to tier 1. I think he was really struggling at the end of the year in tier 2, even in the series that they were winning against Vitality B and against Galleons. Sorry, I completely blanked on the team name there for a second. Even in their winning series, I think he really struggled to get things going consistently in the early game. It didn't always feel like he had full control of the map, and I think that that is arguably the most important thing for translating your game from a lower level to a higher level, is just how confident you can play in the early game and how fast your tempo can adapt, because I think that is something that really good junglers just end up punishing a lot. And I think more specifically, like even watching them in like the group stage of EMEA Masters, like they had some real problems in summer. Now I know a lot of people are going to say it was summer, like you go and watch winter and you watch spring and they were clearly the best team in tier 2. And you know what? I went back and watched basically every single game from spring. You know, I had watched it at the time, but I went back and reviewed it for this video again specifically. And while things were better, most of the better that we saw from this team came from the players I already kind of felt good about. Like I think Reckless is awesome. I think Nemesis and Crowny can have some really solid moments and pop-off moments. Velia for me is a concern, and I hate starting this out in a negative way, but to me, if this team is going to be above like number 9 or number 10, which I think is realistic for them, but if they are going to be above that, it's probably because I'm underrating Velia and that he is actually just better than what I'm expecting. Right now, he is the biggest concern for me on this team. Everybody else I think fills their very specific role and I think could have some upside, but they need a jungler that can compete at this level, because right now his early games just look too flippy, they look too inconsistent, and I'm really not sure that I see a tier 1 player on tape at the current moment. Outside of that, I do like this team. Baus comes in a little bit low in terms of these rankings, number 11, which definitely feels a bit disrespectful, you know, at how much of an impact he's likely going to have on the game. He's not the kind of player that you can really judge by laning performance or anything like that. He obviously is a very unconventional style, even if he can play conventionally, and he does so at a relatively decent level. You know, when he plays conventional, it definitely is a little bit worse. He's like a worse Mirwin in terms of how he plays the game. Obviously, there are quite a few differences, but unfortunately for Baus, top lane is just a position that I feel is actually like sneakily a little bit deep in terms of interesting pieces right now. I'm going to spoil this list a little bit into the future, but he comes in one spot below Imperios, and if you want to say he's better than Imperios, I can kind of understand that. I just would be really surprised if he performed better than Imperios in the league. He'll have his big Baus moments, and I'm sure there are going to be times where he's super impactful and influential in the game, and he's not being factored into this grade quite like a normal number 11 top laner would. Like, he's not dragging down the grade and the rating of this team, because I think his impact is generally very positive on the team as a whole. But the question is, like, not only can he get away with things, because even if he doesn't get away with it, it's like it's probably fine. He's a good enough like average player, but like, can he survive, and can that gold deficit that they were consistently going in onto the top side be punished less than it was towards the end of the year? We even saw with players like Mainter that, you know, you give another top laner a really big gold lead, even if you are making plays around the map, and they're good enough at this level to just be able to win the game on their own. Like, top laners here in the LEC are very strong, so it is just a little bit concerning for me. Again, I'm not trying to be negative towards Baus. I think he's a good player, and they're certainly not feeling bad or anything for having him as a starting top laner in tier 1. I think he'll make the transition fine. I just worry about the same kind of productivity as maybe some of the other top laners. And then for everybody else, the other three, you know, tier 1 experienced players here, Nemesis, Crowny, and Reckless, I think they all showed at different times last year that they were good. Nemesis was really bad at the end of the year, and you just really have to hope that that's not going to happen again. It looked like he was super mental boomed. Obviously, there's been a lot of conversation about that. I'm not going to try and touch on the out-of-game stuff. I can only really review the kind of gameplay that they showed on the Rift, and Nemesis was really not good in summer. He really was a big reason why this team was kind of getting held back in major moments. But before that, in spring, he was one of their best performing players. He still has it in lane. He can definitely step up and be more aggressive. We know he can carry in team fights. That's always kind of been a bit of a specialty for him as a player. So I don't think the transition is going to be that difficult. He comes in at number 8 for me, which I think is a very, very fair grade for Nemesis. Theoretically, you could put him a little bit lower, and I think I'd be okay with that for now. You know, I'm kind of willing to bet on the mechanical talent that we've seen from him. I think he'll be very motivated coming in to this split, and I think he'll perform well, like an average mid laner at this level, which is pretty good for somebody who has not played it in tier 1 in quite a long time. And then the bot lane is without a doubt the strength of this team. I'm sure most LR fans would agree with that. They definitely are the most consistent part and the part of this team that I think elevates a lot of the floor of what you can expect, mostly because Reckless is so good. Crownie is also very good. He's a solid AD carry that should probably still be playing in tier 1, but Reckless is like a very good support. Support's a great position in the LEC. You know, I'm not going to spoil who like 5 and 6 are, but just know that he's like right next to some players that are going to Worlds and like will be competing near the top. I really think that highly of Reckless's tape at support. He just does everything at a high-end level. He's a great laner. He understands exactly where he needs to be. His roams do seem to be a little bit slow, but they're very effective when he does get there. He's a great skirmisher in that regard, and I think he is understanding the role a little bit more. His team fighting is excellent as a support. Like, I really do think he's just a good support player. There's not really a ton else to say in that regard. I think if he were given a full run in tier 1, like on a roster, I think he could pretty easily turn into like a top tier support basically year 1. He has that kind of talent. Again, support is just really stacked. There will be like I'll say this, the 6th ranked support, I'm not going to say who it is, but the 6th ranked support in this video is almost certainly going to Worlds this year. Like, that is, being ranked number 7 in the support position is certainly not meant to be a disrespect. And then last player to talk about is Crownie. Crownie is like your very good AD carry. I don't think he's spectacular in any phase of the game. I think team fighting is about as close as he comes to being like a truly, you know, big difference maker, but he is that above average player basically at everything. I talk about Doctum a lot in this kind of mold where it's that jack of all trades, master of none. I think Crownie kind of fits that, except I think he is a little bit more specialized in terms of the way he plays. Whereas Doctum generates a lot of his leads in the 2v2 in the early game, Crownie is going to get a lot of it by, you know, skirmishing a lot in the mid game and then hoping to play team fights really well, which is totally fine. Crownie's been a world caliber AD carry before, and quite frankly, the tape that I watched from him, even in summer when this team was struggling, but especially earlier on in the year, in spring when everything was clicking for them, there's no reason to believe he couldn't be like an average to above average LEC AD carry like day number 1. Again, it's just a tough role to break into. So generally, if you want an overview of how I feel about LR, I think the bot lane is solid. I think they're going to be effective at this level, and I would be really surprised if they were getting run over at all in the 2v2. I think Nemesis has shown enough tape over the past year and a half to kind of say, okay, you know, yeah, he's going to be inconsistent, but the good games are going to be good, and I think he'll be mentally locked in. It's the top side of the map, and most specifically, quite frankly, it's Velia that concerns me in terms of the tape that we're seeing. I hope that he's going to be able to translate his skill set and what we've seen, but, you know, the laners aren't the best in the entire league, and I think Velia could really struggle in the early game going up against like real LEC junglers. If it works out for him, if he's very good, and if this team is clicking, again, I could see them getting as high as like a 5th or a 6th place finish. Is that insane to say? Like, I think it's possible for this team. I just think that that's probably significantly less likely than them being competitive, but overall not being dominant. I think that they're likely going to finish better than 11th. I just don't really know which teams above them in the power rankings are going to be worse than them. So for now, they end up falling here as a fun team, and one that I really hope does well for the idea of a league as a whole, but one that I think has a pretty low floor. But that's going to bring us to number 10 in my power rankings, and I guess this is the start of the teams that actually did play in the LEC last year and will be playing beyond the Versus split. And coming in at number 10 for me, the bottom of the continuous LEC teams, it will be Na'Vi coming in at number 10. I think this is pretty obvious, quite frankly, to most people. I think people might even have them below 10th in a lot of their power rankings. Teams like Los Ratones definitely have more hype coming into this split than a team like Na'Vi does, but I think that there are pieces on this team that I really like. It's just the overall package that I'm really scared of, and I think, quite frankly, this org has proven nothing up until this point. We really thought they were going to come in to the LEC and make a big splash. They talked a big game, and so far they brought in some really good, interesting young pieces. I think they're doing things the right way stylistically. I just don't know if that ends up resulting in a winning season in full year number 1, we'll just say. So a couple of things to add that were not necessarily here for the other two that did not play in the LEC last year. There are going to be a couple of things in parentheses now. If you see any number in parentheses, this is going to be a comparison number between now and what I had in this particular video for the summer split last year for this team. In Na'Vi's case, you see the number 10 for their power ranking at the top and a -1 in parentheses. That shows that I had them number 9 in my summer split version of this exact video, and they're going -1 in those rankings. You can see the same exact thing for each player, you know, a -5 for Mainter, a +3 for Rylek. Like, these are examples of how I think they have changed from my preconceived notions in summer. It's not end of summer rankings, it's beginning of summer rankings. And the reason I do it like that is because I think it's a more apt and more interesting comparison to say, where did I think this organization was going to be at? Where was the expectation level at for this org, and where is the expectation level at now? And there's obviously some nuance in here. There were players that, you know, did not change at all, that didn't even switch teams, that have some majorly different grades, even if they didn't play all that different, just because the league around them has changed so much. So that's kind of the caveat there, but let's talk about Na'Vi now. Their lineup is looking like Mainter in the top lane, Rylek in the jungle, Poby in the mid lane, Sam D at AD carry, and Paris at support. Of course, there are pluses and minuses to this roster. I think the main big win for this team has not only been the youth movement that they're going for, or promoting a lot of players from tier 2, you know, getting players that played in tier 1 but didn't really get a lot of runway, players like Paris on BDS last year that obviously didn't play particularly well but was an outstanding tier 2 player just the year before. But most importantly for me, it's getting Poby over from Fnatic. They win the sweepstakes here in the mid lane. I don't even know if it was a sweepstakes. It looks like it was really the Vladi sweepstakes, and then Poby kind of went to whatever team Vladi didn't end up choosing, and that ends up being Na'Vi here. But Poby was really good last year. Like, he genuinely did elevate Fnatic. There was a reason that they went from being a non-Worlds team with Humanoid to being a Worlds team with Poby, and I don't think it's quite as simple as saying that Poby was better. I think what Poby was a stabilizing force in the mid lane, and everything that I expected out of him, he was basically identical to what I predicted he would be in that Summer Split Primer video, where I talked about, okay, well, he was like a good mechanical mid laner in the Challengers League, and usually that will translate into being a very good mechanical player in the LEC. We've seen that pretty consistently out of players like Ice. I think he is the most like specific example of that, but even someone like Jun in the support position, it is very obvious that if you bring somebody over from the Challengers League that is good mechanically, they're going to be able to express that in Europe, because mechanics just aren't exactly at an all-time high, we'll just say, in comparison to the rest of the world in Europe right now. And Poby was exactly that. He was a phenomenal mechanical mid laner, and he had a lot of really nice execution moments. He wasn't always super consistent in laning phase, and I think that there were moments where he could kind of blend into the background. He doesn't have the most aggressive mentality in the entire world, but generally speaking, Poby was a top-tier mid laner in the LEC last year, especially in comparison to what I think a lot of the other options would be. And he still barely has a lot of tier 1 experience. He really salvaged and saved Fnatic's year, and then Fnatic kind of repays him by shipping him off. I think, selfishly, I would like to see him have a really good year, because I think I would like to see him prove that he deserves to stay in the LEC. A lot of people were really negative on Poby. He played his best Challengers League tape ever in 2025 before coming over, and then he continued that trend on Fnatic. This is a good pickup, and he is likely the best player on this team from day number 1. But you want to talk about more excitement that comes from the jungle position for me, and it comes with Rylek. They've known that they've wanted this player basically ever since they've existed, right? They signed Rylek first. Like, he was the first jungler that ends up signing to Na'Vi, and then they realized, well, we're not going to be able to get him in for 2025, so we're going to have to go and sign someone else. And someone else they did sign. Thager obviously was the starting jungler for them for their summer split last year. And, you know, all due respect to Thager, he was not an LEC caliber jungler. We kind of knew he was going to struggle quite a bit at this level. He was a big reason why I had a lot of negativity, but it was all to build towards actually starting Rylek in 2026, and now they get the chance to do so. He is probably the best jungler to come out of tier 2 in a good amount of time. I think, and this might be a really controversial take, I'm curious to know how people feel about this. When you're purely comparing tier 2 tape, I think he is a slightly better prospect than Skewmond was. Now, obviously, it's a little bit different. Skewmond came into a much better situation in G2. He really got to do the things that he was good at early on in his career, which is play tanks and play scaling and play for team fights. And, you know, he didn't really have a ton of expectation to be the number 1 carry, and he was allowed to develop into a stronger player because he has a really smart brain for the game. I think it's pretty clear that Skewmond was a more LEC ready player than someone like Rylek is, just in terms of their skill set. But in terms of like upside or like prospect potential, like Rylek's potential, I think, is even higher than what you would have imagined Skewmond's would be. That's not to say he's going to be that player. It's a very different org, a very different situation, and I think that means a lot for players of this caliber, but it's just something to kind of talk about. This guy is ridiculously good in the jungle. He reminds me more of Yike than he does of Skewmond in terms of like a jungle prospect, and for me, he's already coming in as the number 6 jungler in the league. He's never played a game here. Jungle is a position that has always been really up in the air for a lot of different teams. We talked about it last year. Number 6 to number 10, you know, the bottom half of junglers all had the same grade for me, and all of them ranked below average. That's basically never happened in the history of one of these major leagues before. So a player in LEC, who I think is good day number 1, but has the chance to grow into even more, like, is he more interesting than Linsauce? Yeah, he is, right? Like, those are the kinds of players that he's going up against for that number 6 spot, and I just would rather have LEC. So he ranks pretty high for me, and I have a lot of expectation for him from day number 1. This org clearly agrees with me because they signed him and were willing to even wait out an entire split to bring him onto the roster, but him and Poby as a duo could be absolutely nightmarish to go into if everything ends up clicking, and that is likely how Navi is going to win a lot of their games. I do like the addition of Mainter on the top side as well. I talked about this a bit in the offseason grades video. I'm a little bit lower on Mainter than I am on, you know, maybe some other top lane prospects that we'll talk about a bit later, but for this organization, it really makes a lot of sense. People in the comment section were quick to remind me this is a Ukrainian player on a Ukrainian organization, and, you know, with everything going on in the world, it's awesome for Navi to be able to bring in somebody that, you know, can represent Ukraine, like, on the biggest stage. I think that was a big selling factor for them, as it turns out, or as, you know, a lot of people are talking about in terms of the overall community. And Mainter is more than good enough to have earned a tier 1 spot. Obviously, somebody coming off of a KCB run to EMEA Masters finals, KCB would love to still have this guy in their top lane. He's just not the most explosive player in the world. Quite frankly, he's much more weak side than he is strong side. At least that's his role, or that's what his role was in the summer split last year, where he was often put more on an island. He was good in lane, but he wasn't exactly dominant, and he didn't have the biggest impact on the game as a whole. Again, solid player, and someone that I think could grow into something more. I just don't think he's the most mechanically talented player in the universe. I think most of what he does really well is mental. It's very similar to actually how I just described Skewmond, where it feels like he is, you know, a pretty complete package in terms of the game. You just need to make sure that you can get him comfortable and accustomed to playing at the tier 1 level. This is a good pickup. I think there are very few top lane options on the market that would have been better than this, and especially, you know, with the nationality match, I think it was, you know, a perfect fit between him and Navi, but I don't think he's the same kind of, like, dominant takeover threat that I think a rookie like LEC could be for this team in the jungle. But that's the positive for me. The negative is going to be the bot lane, and nobody who's followed this channel for any amount of time, you know, will be surprised by some of these rankings. Both SamD and Paris are coming in at number 11 in their own individual positions. I'm just not a big fan of either of these two right now. Paris is a player that I've loved in the past. In fact, I was ready to go to bat and, like, to die for Paris, like, going into last year. He was the single best support prospect I had ever evaluated coming out of tier 2, and I feel very confident in saying that. That guy completely destroyed games. He was super consistent as a team fighter, somebody who felt very comfortable and confident moving around the map in the mid game and opening things up. He was a solid enough laner. It just felt like he was the total package, and I could see why BDS last year had the choice between him and Lebrov, and they ended up going with him. It was, you know, BDS versus G2 in a bidding war for Paris, and BDS ended up winning, and unfortunately it did not work out for BDS that they ended up landing Paris because it was a huge adjustment period. He was not good last year. There's not even really a ton to say. I think that there were many games that he just was not able to, you know, stay comfortable in. It felt like mentally he was super overwhelmed. I know he had a lot of responsibility on that BDS team last year, and likely they just needed to take it a little bit slower with him. I think playing with a, you know, an AD carry that maybe had some language and communication barriers was also a bit of a problem for him. You're hopeful that you can get him onto this team with other players that are coming up from tier 2, like Mainter, like LEC, even someone like SamD and Poby, you know, that obviously have played a lot in tier 1, but have also, you know, had a lot of time in tier 2 recently as well. You're hoping that Paris can just kind of simplify the game down and get back to what he was good at when he was playing for BDS Academy, but you have to hope that he's going to be able to get back there, because what we saw on tape in the LEC last year in his first full year as a starter was not very good. So that's the 11th ranked support. He performed like that last year. And, you know, people still don't like my grading of SamD. People don't generally like my grades of AD carries here in Europe, but I will stick to my guns. There's nothing on tape that would indicate that SamD is going to be even a league average AD carry at this level. Even last year, like, people were really dogging on me for having this guy as my number 10 AD carry, my last ranked ADC heading into the summer split, talking about how he's going to overperform that. He's really consistent in team fights. You're not giving him enough credit. And man, I just continue to watch the tape and go, like, what does this guy do at an average level? Like, what part of the skill set am I missing out on? He can team fight. He's an average team fighter. That's what he does at an average level. He's a decent team fighter, but only if he has resources, and he doesn't generate those resources himself. He's not really all that good of a laner. He can win lane, but most of the time it's game circumstance and it's draft more than it is his actual gameplay. You can see that in basically everything that he did on Hapone Corp, and that goes back to his time in the, you know, LPL. That goes back to his time when he was playing in Korea as well. Like, there's just never really been a time where SamD has been able to generate resources consistently in the 2v2, and his mid game is really passive. These are the kinds of players that I think generally just get lost in the shuffle at the tier 1 level, and for me, I'm just not super impressed with his skill set. I hope I'm wrong. Everybody loves this guy, but he dropped the Hans out of his name. It's no longer Hans SamD. We don't get Hans Sama versus Hans SamD at any point. It's never going to happen, unfortunately, but I think that was like a huge selling point for him. So we'll see how it goes. He generated a pretty big fan base because of the funny name, and I think generally because, he was a fun player to watch. I just worry about the actual performance here, and I think there is a reasonable chance that this is, outside of KCB, like the worst bot lane in the LEC. I certainly think a team like Los Ratones has a better bot lane that we've already talked about, and that's just not a great place for Navi to be because so much of this team's success is riding on rookies or bounce back moments from the bot lane. Like, the bot lane has to be better than what they were last year. Both of them have to be better, and then Rylek kind of has to be as good as I think he is for this team to have any chance of even competing. If Rylek is like not good day number 1, if he struggles to be able to make that transition, which I think is also decently realistic, this team is probably number 11 or, God forbid, even competing for number 12 in terms of the LEC in the versus split. But I have hope that Poby is good enough to be able to stabilize in the mid lane, and that Rylek and even Mainter are as good as I think they will be. I think there's some really good young pieces. I like the direction of this organization, bringing in tier 2 talent. I just don't know if it's going to pay off right now in the winter split. But then moving on now to number 9 in my power rankings, and this is a team that I think a lot of people are going to claim is too low in these rankings, and honestly, I do kind of see where you're coming from. It's GIANTX, and I don't think this will be a popular number 9 placement. I expect to see this team a lot closer to number 5 or number 6 in a lot of other people's power rankings, and again, I do understand where a lot of people are coming from. Typically, when you look at a team that's retaining all 5 of their starting members from last year, especially when they're coming off of a year where, generally speaking, they were pretty good. They were easily the best of the rest. It was a big 4 in the LEC last year. No real reason to expect that to be any different going into 2026, but they were the 5th best team in the league, like all year long. In winter, in spring, in summer, they were consistently number 5, best of the rest. And so why do I think they're going to get so much worse going into 2026? Why am I looking at this as a potential regression team? Well, I think there's a couple of pretty major factors. I still really like parts of this team, but I actually think there were some over-performances last year from some crucial members that I'm not sure we're going to get that same kind of output in 2026. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is still looking like Lot in the top lane, Isma in the jungle, Jackie's in the mid lane, Noah at AD carry, and Jun at support. Obviously, the bot lane is the centralizing force of GIANTX. There's really no other way around it. If you want to sit here and tell me that I'm too low on this team and that, I'm not putting enough faith and trust into the process that they started building last year, it's going to be because of the bot lane. And quite frankly, I'm not sure there's anyone as high on the bot lane as I am, which makes this ranking even more questionable. I've gone to bat for both of these guys really regularly ever since they came over to the LEC on Fnatic and now here on GIANTX. Both directions I have been big fans of these players, at least in terms of their European output. So why do I have this team so low? Well, it's the surrounding core that I just don't think is very good on this team. I think that, they're right down there with Navi in terms of their top side, with my expectations. In fact, I think their top side is worse than Navi's top side. I just think their bot lane ends up carrying them. So, we'll talk about Noah and Jun because I think we should talk about them first. If you are unfamiliar, well, get familiar because these guys are really, really good. They are the best bot lane that is not on a top tier team in the LEC, and it's not particularly close. Jun is an A- caliber player. Like, that's how good support is. He comes in as my number 4 support, but as I've said forever, it's kind of like a big 4, even really like a big 6 in the support position if you really want to stretch it out that far. Like, Jun is on the same level to me as even someone like an Alvaro. I mean, hell, you could even really put him on the same level as someone like a Mickey X if you really wanted to. I really do think that Jun has that kind of impact on the game as a whole. He's a big playmaker. He can be a primary engage threat. He is a really solid laner. He's just got the complete package in terms of what he's offered. He was an MVP caliber player at times last year, and it really went under the radar because GIANTX was just never competitive near the top of the standings, but he was essential, and this offseason kind of proved that. Fnatic was really, really trying to get this guy. They were willing to give up Razork in order to bring Jun in, but they didn't want to do it. GIANTX didn't want to get rid of Jun. He is the centralizing piece that they are building this entire organization around right now, and they're kind of correct for doing so. He really is an elite kind of support player, and they're very happy to have him, and pairing him up with Noah has obviously been a really, really great decision for GIANTX. Bringing them both over from Fnatic has worked out wonders for them. Noah, I think, is extremely underrated as a player right now. He is almost never mentioned in that same, caliber as a lot of the upper tier AD carries, but on any given day, he can perform just as well as any of those guys can. Now, I did knock him a little bit more than maybe I did in some of the offseason grade videos, if only because I do really think Jun was doing so much for this team, and Noah's job is a ton easier because he gets to play with one of the best supports in the region really consistently, but Noah is adept at being able to take advantage of good resources, and I know that that feels like a contradictory statement for me to say because I've talked about other AD carries in a lot of other instances not really generating their own resources and really being products of the rest of their team, and while I think Noah, in theory, falls into that archetype, I think he does it in a much more proactive way. Yes, he is not the most adept at generating his own resources, but I think one of the major differences between Noah and a lot of the other AD carries that I criticized for not being aggressive enough, not being main characters enough, you know, being stat patters, all of that stuff, one of the big differences for me is just how active he is on the map in terms of starting skirmishes once he does have a lead. He's not going to throw away the game by taking meaningless skirmishes everywhere on the map all the time. You know, there are other players in this league at the AD carry role that are definitely much more volatile in that regard. What Noah does is allow his support to be really good in the early game, generate a pretty solid 2v2 lead because their lane is really effective and strong, and they typically draft for themselves early on in the drafting phase, and then, you know, be really aggressive at taking the gold lead that he has and that he's generated and that the team has gotten for him, and use that to just completely destroy the enemy team more so than I think other AD carries do. I think his mechanics are excellent. I think his team fight presence is really strong. The only big problem for Noah is that he can sometimes shut down in big games, and also he can just get a little ahead of himself in some team fights. That's always been kind of the main thing that people criticize, is that there are going to be times where he's set up in a great spot and he just steps a little bit too far forward, gets hit by a skill shot, and there's your team fight. So you have to hope that he can rein some of that stuff in. It's what keeps him out of being an elite level AD carry, because everything else that he does is like really, really strong, but he's a great player. He is somebody who on any given day can perform just as well as any other AD carry in the league. And so when you're looking at that bot lane for GIANTX, you're kind of wondering, okay, well, how can that not be an upper tier team? You've got one of the better bot lanes in the entire league. The game right now is centralized around finding your main character and being able to enable them in a really big way. The problem is, I'm quite frankly just not in at all on anybody else on this roster. I am much lower, I think, on the 3 members of the top side here for GIANTX, and it's just something that I think is going to limit their upside. I think other teams in the league got better. I think they were able to hide a lot of their weaknesses last year because Noah and Jun were so good, and they still weren't particularly competitive when trying to play against the top 4, and I don't really see how that changes. I think the development that we saw out of the solo laners wasn't something that really encouraged me because it wasn't always going in the right direction. We'll talk about Jackie's first because he's definitely the most noteworthy, name-worthy player elsewhere on this roster. If Jackie's actually turned into the player that everyone wanted him to be in 2025, this would be an entirely different conversation. Legit, if Jackie's was a top 6-ish mid laner, even somebody who could just compete to be middle of the road like an average mid laner at this level, then all of the sudden you're talking about a team that does maybe have the firepower to utilize Jackie's as a secondary carry and get themselves into the top 5. But Jackie's was not good last year. He just was not very good. And the problem, I think, for Jackie's in terms of the curve that he's on, because a lot of people might not know this or notice this if they don't watch a lot of GIANTX games, or if they just kind of heard about him because he was awesome in summer of 2024, was that he wasn't very good before that. In winter, and especially in spring of his rookie year in 2024, he was pretty terrible. In spring, he was playing basically identically to Saken, who everybody was criticizing for being one of the worst players in the LEC, rightfully so. Jackie's was not very good in that split. He just was awesome in summer. Him winning Rookie of the Year, I think, was a complete joke, and I've talked about that regularly on this channel because it's Rookie of the Year, and you had a guy who played well for 2 months win the award. It just felt kind of ridiculous to me. Certainly very rose-colored glasses way to look at Jackie's rookie season, but you were hopeful that that summer split version was him figuring something out. He was another player who didn't quite get promoted from tier 3, but was playing, in a much lower league in the ERLs, and obviously didn't have that high-level experience, and so you knew it was going to be a bit of a learning curve. You were hoping that 2025 was going to be the big year of development for Jackie's, the year that he was going to figure it out and start take over, quite frankly, start to elevate himself like Vladi did over the course of last year. But it was the exact opposite. He reverted to a lot of the tendencies he had at the beginning of his career. I would say if you took the winter split, his first ever split in the LEC in 2024, it's identical to what he showed in 2025, and that's just not really what you want to see. To me, he comes in as the number 9 mid laner in the league. He has a lot to prove to me. He wasn't consistent really at any phase of the game, either laning or in the team fighting stage, and I think, especially with the meta really definitely moving towards more of a shove and roam style, with the boots coming in for free here for mid laners with the new quest in 2026. Like, that's not Jackie's at all either. He wants to be a bit more of a selfish player with his resources. So I don't know. I'm not really feeling all that good about Jackie's heading into 2026. I hope I'm wrong, but it just doesn't really feel like the curve is on. The player that I will continue to compare him to is VTO, except I think VTO's highs were much, much higher. So hopefully Jackie's can get there eventually. I'm concerned. I'd be lying if I said it wasn't like a problem for me right now. And then there's Lot, the other solo laner to talk about here. He's just not particularly exciting to talk about. There are moments where he looks good. I had a lot of people in my comment section telling me I was underrating Lot and underrating Isma, which we will talk about in just a second, but Lot just doesn't really have like a role right now on this GIANTX team. He was asked to play a lot of weak side at the beginning of the year, and I thought he was really comfortable in that role, and because he was so comfortable and so stable in the 1v1 on the top side, on weak side, they ended up pivoting, I think, a little too much into like, oh, is Lot really good? And they started giving him a lot of carry opportunities, and he was pretty bad in spring. He ended up really regressing quite a lot. Again, kind of a happy medium. He was worse than he was in winter, but better than he was in spring. In summer, it's fine. He was okay, and I think there is like a next gear to get into if you are Lot. I just don't really know if he's going to get there this year. Again, top lane I think got really interesting with a lot of the additions from tier 2, and to me, Lot is a player that I kind of expect to get lost in the shuffle because of that. I'm not really expecting this big sophomore breakout. And then there's Isma, and I know people really like what they saw out of Isma at the end of the summer split, but I really just can't shake the fact that he is so one-dimensional. He really has one playstyle that he can go for, and honestly, the way that ended up working out in summer, the evolution that he ended up having towards his game was bot lane was winning a lot more, so he could play more aggressive in the early game. Great. Like, that's awesome, and I hope that happens for Isma and GX, but that is not a plus to Isma for me. Again, I received a lot of, feedback that I was too low on him, and when I rewatched the tape, I see the exact same player I thought I saw, which is the player that is really dominant if he's able to generate leads, especially pre-level 6, if he's playing these big skirmishers, and if he can get priority on especially things like grubs on the top side of the map, he feels a lot more comfortable in that particular game state because he can skirmish out from there, and he can kind of play his own little solo queue style. I think, obviously, things like Elise and Jarvan really fit his play style because those level 3 ganks, he's better at those level 3 ganks than almost any other jungler I've seen. The big comparison that I always gave for Isma is Malrang. I really think they're very similar junglers in terms of the best version of Malrang and what Isma's playstyle is, right? Like, I think that's the playstyle comparison I always give. It's just really hard for him to be able to execute on that in the modern game, while also not really having great solo laners that are going to be pushing up and dominating lane in the early game. So it's just a tough situation. I think Isma could look good on this team, but I think in isolation, do I think the problems that Isma had that made him struggle on SK Gaming for all of those years, do I think they're gone? No, I still think they're very much there. A lot of people have left SK and, revitalized their own careers. We'll just say that org has not always been very good at getting the most out of their talent, but I'm kind of betting against the top side of GIANTX right now. And even if I'm in love with this bot lane, I truly do think they're one of the best in the entire league and one of the best in the entire West on their absolute best day. I just cannot trust the 3 players on the top side of the map right now. I'm lower on them, or on all of them, as opposed to the community, and that just kind of lands where it does. I think they're, again, a team that could be competitive. They're right there in either the C tier or the D tier, whichever one you really want to place them in. They should be a playoff team according to their own expectations, especially because you're running back all 5 members and you're hopeful that inbuilt synergy and that competitive experience will make you better in the winter split than a lot of these teams that are trying to figure that, line of communication out. But I think the overall upside of this team is lower than a lot of people expect, and I'm actually really pushing and really expecting some regression out of them in 2026. But then moving on to number 8 in my power rankings, and this is a team that I'm super excited to talk about because honestly, I really like their outlook going into this year. It's Team Heretics coming in at number 8. I really debated putting this team higher in these power rankings because I actually am really intrigued by what they could become and what they could be, but that's kind of the operative word here, is could become, is what they could be. I'm not entirely certain that they are going to be that, especially from day number 1 with a couple of the pieces that they are bringing in, but I really like the roster building ideas here on Team Heretics, and quite frankly, I think this is just a better version of what they had last year with a more complete roster. So I'm excited to see if they can outperform their, 6th or 7th kind of place finishes that they were pretty regular for in 2025. Their lineup in 2026, though, is looking like Trayson in the top lane, Sheo in the jungle, Saren in the mid lane, Ice at AD carry, and Stend at support. Of course, there are some familiar faces here for Heretics fans, both Sheo and Stend coming back. Sheo was a fantastic retention intention for this team. It looked like he was going to be leaving. There were rumors that he was going a lot of different places, all the way from Fnatic to North America. So I think Team Heretics is going to feel pretty happy that they were able to retain him and bring him back, because he was the central piece for why this team was successful last year. And at this point, I can't really deny it. Sheo has kind of become a bit of an underrated darling. And you know what? Actually, you know what? I can deny that sentence at least a little bit, because I think that there are quite a few opinions out there, we'll just say, about Sheo that I don't necessarily agree with. And, you know, I'm going to use this section at least a little bit to highlight a problem that I have with, I'm not going to just say the LEC community, because this happens in the other leagues and the other regions as well, but I would be lying if I said it wasn't the most prevalent generally in the LEC community, and that's this kind of black or white analysis that I think a lot of people end up having. A player is either bad or they're underrated and incredibly good, and no one's talking about them enough, right? It always seems to just be one or the other, and I think Sheo is kind of a great example of what that crossfire ends up looking like. For many years, I was kind of saying, yeah, Sheo's a good player, but I don't necessarily think he's kind of the cog that makes BDS go, and I may have been wrong about that take. It's up to you to kind of determine whether or not you think that was a good or a bad take at the time. But he comes over here to Team Heretics and he is the cog. He kind of brings the whole team together. He plays really well in the early game, and his mid games are incredibly consistent. He's a phenomenal team fighter. He's always been really great in that phase of the game, and he just kind of turns into a very valuable jungler. And now all of a sudden, every single person you can possibly think of is like, Sheo is underrated. This guy's like secretly one of the best junglers in the league. Like, he's top 2, top 3, and it's just like, can we have like a nuanced take or like a gray opinion instead of these black or white ones every once in a while? A player is not either a bottom 2 jungler or a top 2 jungler. There can be other places that, you know, a player can sit. And for Sheo, I think that he's probably the prime example of that, right? He is a very good player, one that you are more than happy to have on your team, that could be the starting jungler on a team that, you know, regularly pushes to either win the league or make worlds or anything like that. Like, he is good enough to be in that situation, but he's probably not good enough to be the leader of that kind of team. And that, you know, is a totally fine place. Again, like a B-graded player, I think, is more than fair for someone like Sheo, but there are a lot of people out there that will claim he's actually secretly top 3 and super underrated, and there's also people out there that will claim Sheo's overrated and Heretics was actually bad last year and no one cared, and he's actually the 8th best jungler. And I, as per usual, I think a lot of the truth of that situation, at least from my perspective, lands in the middle from what I've seen. He comes in as my number 5 jungler, the best jungler outside of the Big 4, at least in my opinion, the Big 4. Sheo's a great player to have. He is the best player on this Team Heretics team, or at the very least, he is the player I trust the most and the one that will probably have the biggest impact on the game, and they are happy to kind of bring him back as their vocal leader and their overall map leader in game. The other player that is returning here from their team last year is Stend. They took, I don't want to say a punt, because Stend was a very good prospect coming out of the Vitality system. They brought him up as a rookie last year to play with Flakkid, and he was everything that we thought he was going to be, where someone like Paris ended up really underperforming coming in as a tier 2 support. Stend lived up to the billing. He wasn't a superstar in year number 1, but he showed a ton of playmaking flashes and generally was just a positive for the team overall. I think if he can take another step here in year number 2, you're looking at a really good support player. And again, don't take the number 8 into account when you look at like, oh my god, that's incredibly disrespectful. How can you put Stend at number 8? Again, I can't stress enough. He's one spot below Reckless, who's one spot below a player who just went to Worlds last year that people are going to criticize as too low. So don't fret. Like, the support is just one of those roles. It's bad in almost every region. It's not bad at all here in Europe. Stend is a very good player, and Heretics, again, as a playmaker, are happy to have him back as that primary creation option. And the reason that I find that so interesting for this particular Heretics team is because you bring Ice in as the replacement to Flakkid, the new AD carry, obviously long time of BDS, came over from the LCK and the Sandbox system. He is another very specialized player, somebody who has experience playing with Sheo in the jungle, which is exciting. But that specialization, I think, fits well within the confines of what Heretics want to do. He is a team fighter, pure and simple. He kind of reminds me a lot of Aiming over in the LCK. I'm not going to say he's the exact same player, but I think he's kind of built in that mold. If you want like a less exciting or a more exciting comparison, maybe somebody a little more explosive, he's like a slightly worse version of someone like Pays, right? Like, I wouldn't even say slightly. He's like a worse version of someone like Pays from a playstyle perspective. He loves Jinx and Zeri and wants to play for these late game team fights. Is a decent laner, but only insofar as to generate like neutral game states. He's not necessarily going to go out there and dominate, especially very lane focused bot lanes or 2v2s that try to capitalize on him. But he is so adept at playing front to back in these 5v5s and being able to take over even from a neutral state in the later part of the game, that a lot of the time when BDS was finding their biggest successes, especially in 2024, not so much in 2025, it was when they were just saying, screw it, we're picking Ice Jinx and we are just playing for him every single game. Labrava is going to play for team fights, Sheo is was going to play to set up bot lane, and they were just going to put a lot of resources into making sure Ice was in as comfortable of a position as he possibly could be. I could see a very similar situation. I think you might even have a pretty similar build to that BDS team, not only because of Sheo, but because I think Stend can kind of fill that playmaking mold really well. He might even be more of an aggressor and more of a mid-game playmaker than someone like Labrov was, even if he's not quite as good of a team fighter, really at any stage, in my opinion. And then I think you have explosive talent elsewhere on this roster. I really like Trayson in the top lane. I think this guy is going to be really good. He's my favorite of the rookie top laners coming in, you know, whether it's Mainter or obviously like Baus that are getting some shots, even someone like Tao, obviously on KCB. I think Trayson is the most interesting, and Pyros is another one for Fnatic. We'll talk about a bit later. I think Trayson is the most interesting and, in my opinion, the best of the rookie top laners, and I'm really excited to see what he can become for Heretics. This is a phenomenal internal promotion. I really like Carlson. I think he's underrated by most of the community. I just talked about how, you know, there are some players here that are underrated. I think Carlson was actually really good last year for this team, especially down the stretch as a stabilizing force on the top side. He's not the most, like, eye-catching player in the world, but Carlson did a lot of the little things right. But at the end of the day, when you have the opportunity to promote Trayson internally and to have a player with that kind of upside in the top lane, I think you do it. This is a very Knock-Knocko type of promotion, in my opinion. You know, people were really hyping that guy up because of his raw mechanics, and we'll talk about Knock-Knocko a bit later on this list. But Trayson, to me, fills a very similar void of ridiculous mechanical player that can dominate laning phases, can be a bit inconsistent, but I think he does have a good mind for the game. It feels like he understands where he needs to be in the mid to late game. If he's going to come in and just be an upgrade to what Carlson was, if he can kind of fill that Adam role in the BDS comp that I'm giving them, then yeah, I think Heretics all of a sudden looks like an incredibly dangerous team with the super stable and consistent bot side, a jungler that knows exactly what they should be doing, and a top laner that you absolutely cannot ignore, or he's going to generate a ton of resources and advantages in one-on-ones because his hands are so good. A lot of this does come down to Saren being solid, but honestly, this is another good move, and I know this is, you know, something that the grading scale doesn't necessarily look at super favorably. He comes in as my number 10 mid laner, and there's even a -1, but the context behind that -1 is super relevant. Camelou came in as the 9th best mid laner in the league for me going into summer, and that's because obviously there were only 10 teams and not 12, and also because for some reason SK Gaming went out and signed Abadaga, and there are very few mid laners that I would have ranked below Camelou, but Abadaga was absolutely one of them. So just ends up, you know, kind of looking a little funny, but this is a big upgrade in terms of consistency in the mid lane. Saren, obviously somebody who's spent some time in tier 2 over the past couple of years, but, you know, long time LoL Esports fans will remember this guy going to Worlds from Turkey many years ago, and so very excited to see a player with that kind of veteran leadership or experience come in. He was really stable, and I thought his mechanics were fine in tier 2 last year. This guy isn't exceptional. He's not going to be punishing lane matchups in the way that, you know, someone like Trayson would be on the or would be able to do on the top side with his mechanical advantage. But again, that stability and quite frankly, in this meta, the ability to shove and roam and play for your jungle, I think Saren does that really well, and I think he's going to fit in the current game really well. So I like the build of this Heretics team. Why are they so low? Why are they only at number 8? Well, there are a couple of pretty major question marks. First and foremost, the highest rated player on the team for me is Sheo, and I don't really know if Sheo is the kind of player you want as a top 1 or top 2 player on your team if you're trying to be like top 5 or top 4. I think they're very good players, and I would love to have Sheo. Sheo is a building block foundational type of piece if you have other options. He's just not a carry. He's not the kind of person that you want to be the captain of the team and everybody kind of falls in and lets him, you know, take over the game. He's going to win you games against weaker teams, but against the best teams in the league, you just need a little bit more than that. As we saw with this team last year, you're hoping you get that out of Ice and Stend, but just as I talked about, perhaps, you know, Stend being a more aggressive version of Labrov could help BDS. I could also see a world where Ice wants to play a lot slower than maybe the rest of the team wants to play, and that could actually take someone like Stend out of his own comfort zone, or it could take resources out of the hands of someone like Trayson, you know, even Saren. Like, you want to make sure that this team feels balanced and that they actually have a way to be able to play the game, and just generally you hope you don't get any regression from Stend, or that Trayson kind of hits the ground running with his mechanical ceiling. There are things that can go wrong for this team. That's why they're not coming in number 5 or number 6 or anything like that in the power rankings, but as a C tier team that is genuinely very, very interesting to look at, could I imagine a world where they do, you know, compete for top 4 or top 5 if everything goes right? Absolutely. I think they're built to be kind of close to that. There are just a few more question marks on this team than some of the ones above them, but quite frankly, I love the offseason. I love the construction of this team, and I really do think they'll do well this year. But that's going to bring us to our number 7 team in my power rankings. And, you know, like I said before, we're really in the thick of the C tier here. These are teams that I think are competitive, are, you know, solid enough teams, but I'm certainly not convinced are definitely going to be good, have high ceilings, low floors, that kind of thing. We already talked about it a bit with Heretics, but the team right above them is in a very similar spot. It's Team Vitality for me coming in at number 7. You know, them and Heretics I think have very similar grades. You can really put them in whatever order you want. I just think the floor here is a little bit higher with some of the players they have. I kind of like the fit of some of the players on this team. I just don't really ever see a world where they are truly competitive. I was much lower on their offseason, and this is how I can really showcase the distinguishing differences, we'll just say, between the offseason grades video and this one. I was much more complimentary of Team Heretics offseason. I think they have a much more interesting roster and a much better future, but Vitality is probably better right now. They're probably better in the winter split, and I can kind of talk about why. Their lineup is looking like Knock Knocko in the top lane, Linsauce in the jungle, Humanoid in the mid lane, Karzi at AD carry, and Fleshy at support. Of course, a couple of members returning from last year, 4 of the 5 members from this Vitality roster returning. I think that's going to help this team out of the gate, where I wasn't quite sure if it was going to help GIANTX, because I'm not sure they're going to be able to recapture the mechanical form they were in at the end of the year. I think it will help Vitality, because most of the things that were wrong with that team were just things you expected to be wrong with that team, if we're being quite honest. It's Karzi being an absolute madman and never being consistent. That's a take that I've had for a long time on this channel. Boy, like 2023 viewers of Super K-Man Rocks will remember the wars that were happening in the comments section about me ranking Karzi the 6th or 7th best AD carry in the league, and look how times have changed. Now this seems to kind of just be the popular opinion. It's me being a little bit lower on the top side of the map, but also kind of coming into understanding where this team is at right now and seeing the upside of bringing someone like Humanoid into the team while also not really getting excited overall. I'm not going to get into the idea that Chayak would be fantastic here, and that Chayak was fantastic here last year, the best player on Vitality, but Humanoid he's got some big shoes to fill in terms of being able to replicate this. So, you know, we can talk about him first because I think he's the most intriguing and most important piece on whether or not this team lives up to their own potential. Even if I think this was the wrong move from an organization perspective, Humanoid will make them a competitive team. Like, as much as I don't really like Humanoid, I don't think he's been, you know, as good as everyone would say he has been. I don't think the name value matches up with the actual production that's been on the Rift really at any point in his career. I think you could maybe talk about like 2022 or 2021 being some really good years for him, but I think especially in recent memory, like, it's been so hit or miss, it's been so feast or famine. There will be multiple times per year where this guy just completely shuts off, and you just kind of have to live with it. I don't think that's going to get better on a team that is almost certainly going to be less competitive than Fnatic was for a very long time. One of the big running gags on this channel was, oh, you're not allowed to talk about Humanoid because it's not the playoffs yet. This is clearly not Humanoid. And that, you know, kind of served itself to be true for a lot of his tenure on Fnatic, where he would just completely run down certain regular seasons. He would die level 3 in the same position multiple times per split, and it would get really frustrating to watch, and then the playoffs would come around and this team would be on the brink of elimination, and he would be like, oh, I guess I have to play the game now, and he would start trying, they would go to Worlds, and he would look good internationally, and the whole cycle would repeat. I hope that's not the case for him on Vitality. I hope he's motivated after getting benched last split. It does feel like he is. He's been playing some tier 2 games, you know, kind of in and out, playing top lane a little bit. So it does seem like he has the itch to continue playing at a high level, and he gets to play with one of his best friends in Karzi, who I'm sure was the big selling point to come to this roster. But, you know, Humanoid's not a peak consistency type player. He is somebody who you have to hope you're going to get most of a good split. You have to accept the fact that there are going to be multiple games that he is just not very good, where he's not mentally locked in, where he makes a ton of mistakes in the early laning phase and actively puts himself into disadvantageous positions, because that's just who Humanoid is. But every other game is usually pretty good. He comes in as a top 5 mid laner for me, just outside of the big guys. He comes in right below Poby, who was better than him when he replaced him on Fnatic. Of course, you have to talk about Karzi on this team as well, but honestly, Karzi is more like the backup right now to Humanoid in my brain. Maybe he ends up taking more of an important role in terms of how this team allocates resources, and I could definitely see that being possible, where Humanoid's just kind of left on his own, and he's not, you know, super main character. He just kind of does his own thing in the mid lane, and then, you know, they just play around Karzi and try to get him ahead and hope that Humanoid wins in his 1v1 matchups. I could definitely see that being more of a possibility, but Carzzy is everything I just said about Humanoid, except he's a little bit worse, right? Like, he is super flippy. He's going to have a few more bad games than Humanoid will. I would say it's probably close to 60-40 now when it comes to Carzzy. Wasn't always that kind of ratio. I think 60% of his games are fine. Actually, you know what? I think the fair way to put it, 50% of his games are fine. 40% of his games are not very good, pretty bad. And then I would say about 10% of his games are excellent. And those 10% kind of stick in a lot of people's minds. I think a lot of people remember the games where he pops off or the weeks where he pops off, because typically when he has really good or really bad games, they come in succession, they come back to back, and that's kind of the Carzzy legacy. Is he's going to have a couple of weeks this year where he looks like the best AD carry in the league. He's going to have a couple of other weeks where he gets his support fired, because he's done that multiple times throughout his career because he played so terrible, and then most of the split he'll be somewhere in the middle. So just kind of is what it is for Carzzy. You got to take the good with the bad. He comes in as the number 7 AD carry, super inconsistent, but not somebody that's going to, you know, prevent you from being a playoff team. Just probably somebody who's, you're not expecting him to be a driving force on a team that makes worlds anymore. I just don't think he's in that position of his career. Fleshy, I think, can help with that. He comes in as the number 9 support. Again, support's a pretty good position. Coming in at number 9 usually is decently disrespectful. It's not meant to be in Fleshy's case. I think he's fine. He hasn't necessarily shown anything to be spectacular quite yet. I liked him as a prospect, even liked him when he was in North America, because he had absolutely no chance on that Immortals roster back in the day, but it was just really hard to judge his situation last year, specifically because he was playing in, you know, he came in for Niski, who was a disaster, a complete failure of a project in the support position, was one of the weaker players in the entire league. It just did not work. He was not ready to come in and play that role at a professional level. And then I continue to be a massive Hylissang defender, and I will continue to be a massive Hylissang defender. Did he completely run down their chances in that playoff run in the final week of the regular season? Absolutely. Was he the only reason that they were in the playoffs to begin with in the winter split? Yeah, kinda. And I think people forget that, right? Like, he was just trying so many things. Again, Lehens is a comparison, On is a comparison for the Hylissang playstyle. Fleshy is not that kind of player. He's much more stable. He doesn't have the highs, he doesn't have the lows. You just kind of have to take the neutral with him, and I think that's okay with someone like Carzzy, who already, you know, in and of itself is going to be pretty feast or famine. But Fleshy's just not a particularly impressive player. I don't really see a ridiculous upside for him. I think he's a stable starting support, which is more than fine in this league. And then you get to the top side, and this is where I think I'm just a bit lower. At times I'm a bit higher, because I'm higher on Linsauce, I think, than consensus, or at least at the, you know, what we've seen in recent memory, which is a fine enough LEC caliber jungler, which he was not always. But I'm definitely a bit lower on Knock. I've said that, you know, pretty much since day one, since he's been in the LEC. He is a ridiculously talented player, and I want to make it clear, I'll say this in every video that Knock is in. I understand when people tell me this guy was awesome and, you know, he showed everything you wanted to see. I agree with you from like a process perspective that he showed everything you wanted to see in year number 1 as a rookie. He was as mechanically talented as you could want, and he was everything that he was expected to be in that first year. But he is a highlight player. Like, let's not try and get that twisted in a lot of different ways. This is a guy who, on his best games, will be up 50 CS, destroying lane, and there are going to be some games where he is throttled, where he gets absolutely destroyed, or there have been games where he's up 30, 35 CS and up like 300 gold in laning phase, 500 gold by himself in laning phase, and then he does absolutely nothing with it. He gets into a fight randomly on the top side and loses all of his advantage. Like, there are multiple things that just have to be cleaned up. I am right there with you, all of the Knock fans. I am right there with you with the idea that this guy has like 95 to 99 overall potential, right? Like, if you're looking for a potential ability, this guy is like near the maximum that you can get for a top lane position in terms of what his potential could be. But the reality is that his current ability, for all my football manager fans out there, it's just not there yet. It can get there, and I think it probably will, because top lane right now is begging for someone to take that number 3 spot, for someone to be, you know, right behind the big 2, even really the big 1 right now with how Broken Blade played at times last year. Like, somebody needs to really step up and kind of take that big leap this year, and I think Knock was in a great position to be that guy, but he didn't show that in his rookie year. He showed a flawed player who has a lot of things he needs to work on, but has the potential and all of the tools necessary to become one of the best top laners in the West. So I'm hopeful that he can get there, but for now, he ranks as the number 6 top laner for me. This feels generous in terms of a grade. I am kind of factoring in this idea that he is going to play better than he did last year, basically no matter what, and I'm hopeful that will be the case. Like I said, for Linsauce, he's not like an outstanding jungler. I would never expect him after the beginning of his LEC career to come in and kind of change that perception to be one of the better, you know, up-and-coming young junglers in the league. It just doesn't really feel like he's on that kind of growth trajectory, but after having a really tough start for Vitality, he has settled in. I think last year we saw somebody that was probably probably the best of the rest in the jungle position. You know, I think the top 5 are pretty clear. You know, we talked about Sheo kind of being that border between the good junglers and kind of the more questionable ones. I think for a lot of last year, Linsas was probably the best of the rest of that group. And if he's going to be somewhere in that vicinity around the 6th or 7th best jungler, that's more than enough for this team. He doesn't need to be a carry. He just kind of needs to facilitate what is clearly Humanoid and Karzi's team. Like, that is just the way that they're built. Even Nako is going to be a primary character because of the way that he plays the game. So Vitality have a very clear way that they're going to play. There are going to be some weeks where they are capable of taking down the best teams in the entire league when Humanoid and Karzi and Nako are all clicking and everything is looking good. And I can pretty much guarantee you that there is going to be at least one series this year where they lose to the worst team in the league, because that's also what, you know, Humanoid and Karzi and Nako do. The consistency isn't there, but the excitement is. I'm hopeful we can get something a little bit more in the middle, which is why they come in here at number 7. But then moving on to number 6 in my power rankings, and this is a team that is really hard to justify putting as high as number 6, like, mentally for me, because I think there's so many holes in this roster, but I have to believe in the top-end talent. I have to believe in the vision. It's SK Gaming for me, coming in at number 6. I can't believe I'm putting this team above Heretics and Vitality, because even in my heart of hearts, I don't really know if I feel comfortable saying that, but man, this roster's got Mickey, Wonders coming into a league that is, like, desperate to find any top laner that can try to compete to be top 3 or 4. Skeens, I think, was better than I expected. I like Joppa in terms of what he could be as an AD carry in this league. Leader is here, so you know there are things to like with this SK Gaming roster. It's just so hard to believe that this team's floor is anywhere near top 6, because it really isn't. There is a world where this team is a complete disaster this year, but I have to bank on this idea that SK is going to be as good as I hope they can be. So let's go ahead and talk about just the funniness of this team. Their lineup is looking like Wonder in the top lane, Skeens in the jungle, Leader in the mid lane, Joppa at AD carry, and Mickey X at support. Like I said before, if I'm pronouncing anybody's name wrong, just let me know. You know, I watch all of these games on 1.25 or 1.5x speed, as you know, to get through all 4 or 5 regions that I cover on this channel. So, you know, just let me know about pronunciation errors if they do arise. I mean, how can you talk about SK Gaming without talking about Mickey X? Like, come on, man. Like, this is his team. It's not just in like, oh, he's the captain, he's the leader. No, he's the GM. He might as well be the owner right now of SK Gaming. They signed him on before, like, summer was even over, before he had ever even qualified for Worlds from Fnatic. He basically had a deal to come over here from everything that's been reported, and the deal was, hey, Mickey X, if you come to our organization that has not been competitive in over a decade, if you come to our organization, you can do whatever the hell you want. Like, bring on whatever players you are most interested in, you know, do whatever you want with the roster that we have. It does not matter. Build the roster that you want to play with, and that's exactly what he did. He brings in his boys. He brings in Wonder. Obviously, him and Wonder have played a lot together on G2, and he doesn't stop there. He brings in his boy in the mid lane, in Leader, as well. You know, it's come out in some podcast interviews since then that he was pushing for Leader to be the replacement for Humanoid in the summer split last year for Fnatic, and Fnatic shut that down pretty quick, and obviously we'll talk about why that ends up being the case, but this is Mickey X's team, and the joke I made in the offseason grades video was Mickey X was a big fan of the LCK last year because he's completely copied Nongshim's roster building decisions, and he just wants to make himself the next Lehens for some reason. Being on this team with, like, no talent, and he has to do everything he can out of the support position. But jokes aside, like, obviously Mickey is still fantastic. The only, like, almost joking concern that I have for Mickey X is that he genuinely has always just been better in odd years than he is in even years. I'm not saying that that is something that I expect to just be true forever, but, like, man, is it a weird kind of coincidence throughout his career that basically every best year of his career happens in an odd numbered year. 2019 was certainly the best year of his entire career. 2023 was one of the best years he's ever had. He revitalized himself on Fnatic in 2025 last year, and some of the weakest years he's ever had have been in even numbered years. I would say 2022 is pretty easily the weakest year of his career when he comes onto that Excel team, and is like the main reason they don't make Worlds, which is an insane thing to say in hindsight. And he was also replaced on G2 after 2024 for a reason. He was disastrous on that team, in my opinion. So you have to hope that you're getting the good version of Mickey X. If you get the even year number Mickey X, that is going to be a bit of a problem, because I don't think there's much else in terms of playmaking on this team. The other two players that you like here, Wonder and Skeens on the top side of the map. Wunder, I don't really have a lot to say about. You know, I have him ranked really high at number 4 because he's Wunder, even if he wasn't necessarily at that level the last time we saw him. He was still pretty close, and there are just so many uncertainties right now in the top lane position. I think it's a strong position regionally. Like, you've got a lot of young rookies or second-year players coming in that show a lot of promise. The only major issue is that you just can't really guarantee that those players' floors are particularly good. I feel pretty good that Wunder, bare minimum, is going to be an average top laner in the LEC. Like, I would be stunned if he's worse than the 7th or 8th best top laner in the LEC, really at any point throughout this year. So he comes in at number 4 just sheerly because of his consistency and the fact that I really would just be surprised if he ended up being bad. And then you're bringing Skeens back, the only player that is returning from this SK Gaming roster. I lambasted the decision to bring Skeens into this organization when they made it in summer of last year because, man, go look at his TCL tape. Like genuinely go watch him play in the TCL and tell me that you would have signed this guy under any circumstance. I certainly wouldn't have, and I went back and watched his tier 2 tape just to make sure that I wasn't losing my mind, but he was absolutely horrific before he got signed by SK. He was the only player to show really any consistent signs of life. Kadui was fine in the AD carry role, but Skeens was clearly kind of the hero of SK last year, the one player to get them 2 wins in the summer split, so retaining him makes a lot of sense. I don't think he's a superstar. I think we kind of inflate his value a little bit because he played for such a terrible team with so many terrible players last year that he was the only bright spot, like the only thing to go well. I still think he has a ton to prove. He is going to rank relatively well coming in as my number 8 jungler because I think he was decently good last split. He wasn't perfect. He still has a lot of work to do, but if you were going to retain one player, it was almost always going to be Skeens. And then you've got the carry duo, and this is where things get more interesting. We'll talk about Joppa last because I want to end on a high note. It's Leader, man. Like, everybody who knows him or knows, you know, adjacently who he is as a player will understand why I'm hesitant to put this guy high at all in his position. He's going to rank as my number 11 mid laner in terms of floor coming into this split, and I really don't think you can possibly look at this any other way. Leader as a player has had some really interesting moments in competitive. Obviously, the Astralis era is what a lot of people are going to remember him the most for because he actually had some really big carry moments on those teams that were more competitive than people remember. He's just a one-trick pony. Like, again, not so much in terms of his actual champions, although his champions are limited, but in his playstyle. He needs to be aggressive, and really, he is a melee mid lane player. This is a guy who is going to spam Yone. He is going to play a Kali. He's going, you know, he's built in that Zeka mold, as I've always called it. This organization has always really valued that kind of playstyle, even going back to someone like Certus that they had many years ago, or a couple of years ago now. Leader is just a more specialized version of that. This is the weird thing, right? The last time he was in the LEC, it was clear there was a major effort from him to try and expand that playstyle. He was playing a lot more control mages. He was trying to level up on things like Azir and Orianna that were super meta at the time and still are incredibly meta, will forever be meta because those champions are just broken from a kit perspective. He was trying to get better on those champions and play them a lot more in the competitive scene, and then he's gone. He's no longer playing in tier 1, and he's not even really playing in tier 2. He goes to solo queue, he goes to streaming, he goes to hanging out with his buds, and he just goes right back to playing a lot of the melee mids in solo queue. It feels like a lot of that effort and that progress to expand that champion pool has not carried over the past couple of years, and if that is the case, then he is going to struggle. This is not the kind of meta right now where you can spam aggressive mid laners and be able to make it work. It's just not really how the game is working right now. You get free boots, you need to roam. Like, you have to shove and roam right now. It's just the most valuable thing you can do out of that position, and I just don't think he fits that kind of meta right now. So I'm hopeful that I'm wrong. I think mechanically he's also kind of, you know, the last time we saw him, he was definitely above average mechanically in the LEC. There are a lot of talented mid laners now in the LEC that weren't necessarily there 3 years ago when this guy was getting his shot. So I think there really is room for him to break back in and be, at the very least, like an average to slightly below average mid laner because of his, you know, limiting playstyle. But I also think there's like a floor where this guy is absolutely terrible, which is why it's really scary to rank him. And then you've got Joppa at AD carry. I actually kind of like his tape. This is another reason why I feel comfortable putting SK at 6, because I actually think this bot lane is going to be good as long as Mickey X isn't completely trolling. I would have preferred a veteran here. I think you kind of need someone who can stabilize this team because you have Skeens and Leader as the middle of the map here. You know, the rumor for a lot of the offseason was Ven. He was even teasing it on his stream. I would have loved that move. I think that kind of player fits this idea perfectly. Joppa is in that playstyle where he can be a little bit resource light in the early game and allow, you know, Mickey to roam and play more aggressive on the map and make sure that the middle of his map is not running it down while also still being relevant in team fights. The problem is he's obviously just much less proven, and he wasn't like a superstar at the tier 2 level. level. He was just a really interesting player. I think he has solid mechanics, and I think, you know, he's safe, which is kind of what you're looking for. But do I think he's like a better punt than this team has had in the last couple of years? No, man. They've had so many 80 carries come through this system, come through this organization. All of them have not looked great in the SK uniform and then gone somewhere else and been a lot more effective. I've named multiple ADCs that have done that over the past couple of years. I mean, you can look at even going back as far as Crowny when Crownshot was on this team. You can look at somebody like Exa, who obviously just won the EMEA Masters last year with KCB. You have someone like Rahel over in North America now finally coming into his own. Even someone like Kadui, I could see having that kind of arc. It just feels like AD carry in this org has been a nightmare position for them for as long as you can possibly remember, and that does not fill me with confidence that Joppa is going to be any different. So do I think he's a good punt? Sure. Do I think he's a better punt than Kadui? Probably not, and Kadui already couldn't make it on this team, so I don't really know. Do I feel good about SK? It's impossible to say you feel good about SK Gaming, right? Just the black cloud that hangs over this organization is hard to ignore, and it's hard to just completely piece out of your mind. But generally, when I look at this roster, I see a team that should be middle of the pack. They should be the middle of the standings. They're probably going to have enough star talent with Mickey and with Wunder and hopefully with Skeens to be able to take down a lot of the bottom tier teams. But this team is just not complete enough to ever try to compete at the top of the standings. Something miraculous would have to happen in the middle of the map for that to be the case. Still, SK is very fun. They're going to be an interesting team to talk about throughout this split, and probably going to be some headline warriors in terms of the titles of these videos. But then moving on to number 5 in my power rankings, and this is the only team that changed names in between last year and this year. This is the top of the C tier to me. It is Shifters now coming in at number 5. Of course, formerly Team BDS last year. They are renaming to Shifters going into 2026, and this has got to be the last year for this, you know, kind of core, for this version of this roster. It's now or never, I think, for this team. They have really built around this idea of Nuke in their main core in the mid lane, obviously, and then, you know, you brought in Rooster and Bukata last year at different times. You're really upgrading your bot lane. If this idea of building around Nuke is ever going to work, it's going to have to work this year, because I think you're just running out of chances and you're running out of opportunities. And quite frankly, last year was a disaster. This team was a bottom 3 team basically the entire year with roster talent that needed to be much better than that. And, you know, you can see from my ranking here at 5 that I think they will be better than that, but I had them basically at number 5 in every power ranking last year as well, and they just never were able to live up to it. So we'll see if they can do that this year. Their lineup is looking like Rooster in the top lane, Bukata in the jungle, Nuke in the mid lane, Paddock at AD carry, and Trimby at support. Nuke is the franchise player of Shifters at this point. He is the franchise player that they brought in many years ago, that BDS, of course, brought in many years ago, and he has been, you know, retained. He has been the one player that has survived so many different iterations of this team, going to Worlds and then not being competitive and then being competitive. He is the one player that has been able to, you know, stay through it all. And I've been a huge Nuke defender on this channel for most of my history, but I can't ignore the fact that he absolutely took a step back last year. It is pretty clear that for the first time ever in his career, the graph was not pointing up. I was really excited for him in 2025 because, quite frankly, as a player, like that progression graph that I often talk about for a lot of young players, it looked phenomenal. Like he had that, I call it the Delight graph. And I know that obviously Delight's not the only player in the world who's ever had, you know, a career trajectory like this, but it's one of those things where even if you start low, like if you're looking at a graph of player development and it's just pointing up every single year that a player has ever played, you feel pretty good about that player. And that's kind of how it felt for Nuke, a player who came into the league as one of the weaker mid laners I had seen playing in the LEC in quite a while, and basically just got better every single year, culminating in 2024, where I think he was like an MVP caliber player for a large majority of that year, and it just did not keep going in 2025. I think especially down the stretch of the year, a lot of problems on the team were happening, a lot of synergy issues were going on. And Nuke, I think, regressed pretty heavily. He kind of became an average to slightly below average mid laner by the end of the year. I have a lot of belief that he's going to be able to figure it out and get himself back into a decent position, but can I rank him in the top 5 after what I've seen recently? No, I just can't. I think that there are other players that I believe in more right now, and I think especially with so much pressure on this org and on this coaching staff and on the project that's kind of been centered around him for a very long time, he has to be the star on this team. I think he can be a top 3 mid laner in the LEC because I think he has has been a top 3 mid laner in the LEC before. He just needs to be able to get back there and show more of that earlier tape, especially the 2024 tape as opposed to that 2023 tape. The rest of the roster I think is looking good though, and that's why I have some confidence. I think the player retentions were smart, if not necessary in some cases. We'll talk about Bukata in just a second, but I want to talk about Rooster first because he was the other player last year that I think you just felt incredibly good about coming out of the summer split. He was everything you wanted him to be and then some, right? Like, I'm not going to sit here and say that Rooster was perfect or that he completely dominated and took over games. There was a reason this team got 8th in the playoffs. It's not like he was running the entire game from the top side of the map, but he comes in as my number 3 top laner in the entire league because the laning is there. Like, that's why you brought him in, because he is an expert caliber laner, somebody who can be a top 1 or top 2 laner in that top lane position basically from day number 1, and he was exactly that. Go look at his statistics, and more importantly, go eye test yourself, like on the broadcast, watching him lane in some of these matchups. He's in really great positions against very talented players in matchups that most players are not generating advantages in. He is what you thought he would be, and I think that there are a lot of reasons to expect him to take another leap here in his first full year over in the LEC. I think it takes a lot of these players some time to feel comfortable moving to, you know, Europe and to getting acclimated with the culture and with the team environment. I think another year for Rooster here is a very good idea, and I'm expecting him to be the breakout star in the top lane this year. You know, the top 2 are the top 2. You kind of know who they are right now, but I think Rooster is the best of the rest in terms of these other top lane players, and I wouldn't be surprised if he was kind of similar to how I was talking about somebody like Photon for a very long time for Vitality later on in the year. You're also retaining Bukata, of course, in the jungle. This one I feel less good about, quite frankly. Not that I feel terrible about it. I still think there's some upside with Bukata, and clearly, you know, BDS and Shifters thought the same last year when they paid a truly ridiculous amount to buy him out from his SK Gaming contract and bring him over just sheerly off the amount of money that you spent on him, the $250,000 that seems to kind of be floating around. He better be starting in here at the jungle position throughout 2026, but he really has not shown anything at the LEC level yet to make me feel comfortable that he's going to be a good starter. He has been pretty consistently below average at a lot of different traits. I would never say that he's been game ruining or game throwing. He's never been the biggest problem, even on SK when that team wasn't doing particularly well. It never really felt like he was losing them the game, but he is not pushing games forward right now. Like, he is absolutely not generating tempo or resources. He's just kind of there and along for the ride, and he does need to be better in that regard to really have any shot of making this like a worthwhile transaction for BDS or for Shifters now, because like I said, they spent a lot of money and a lot of resources to get this guy here. They clearly believe in the player, but for now, he can only rank as my number 9 jungler, and in fact, I think there is an argument that he could rank even lower. There are players that have never played in the LEC that I believe in more than Bukata, and I think that's just where his value is at right now. Then you get to the bot lane, completely overhauled bot lane here for Shifters. Trimby's coming back over from the LTA South, kind of dominating that region for 1 year and coming back to Europe. And then, of course, Paddock coming over from the LCK. We'll start with Trimby because he's an easier conversation to have. This guy's a top 5 support in the league for me. Some people might consider this a little bit too high. If you know the top 5 supports from last year, you'll recognize that one of them has been knocked to number 6 because Trimby has come back into the league. But this is just how highly I view what Trimby is capable of doing. Not only did he prove it last year, obviously on VKS, that he is able to kind of push a team forward and really be able to elevate them into a strong position, but he's never been anything other than very good at the LEC level. Even when he was an emergency substitute for Team Heretics when they benched Kaiser for basically no reason on that team, he was still not the problem there, and every year before that, he was genuinely one of the best supports in Europe. So I feel very good about Trimby. I think he's an interesting kind of player because he kind of breaks the mold of what you would expect out of a top tier support. Almost every top tier support is very playmaking focused. They want to get out on the map and really open things up. You know, that core JJ style that he really popularized back in 2019. Trimby is not that. Trimby is a very lane-focused support, which I just don't think you get a lot of anymore in the modern game, and I still think it can be very valuable. It can be very difficult to deal with when you have a team that is really structured around making sure their AD carry can dominate the early game and snowball games out of control. It's what we saw for many years on Rogue with Comp at his absolute best, is you could just get him into some great positions with a lot of gold and he could start to take over games. Hansama was in a very similar spot when he was playing with Trimby, so that's going to be his bread and butter, and I think him coming back here as a vocal leader, as a locker room guy, like, I think it's just a great add, and I think this is a big win for Shifters and a big upgrade to bring him in over a player in Paris that just never lived up to expectations last year. And then Paddock in the AD carry role, another player that I think is very interesting to talk about, but for almost exactly different reasons. There is a chance that Paddock comes in and like obliterates this league day number one, and that's just because of his raw aggression and mechanical talent. I have no way to really describe this guy other than all gas, no brakes. Like, that is Paddock as an AD carry. He is what everyone thinks Jackie Love is. Like, when you hear Jackie Love in your brain, like the idea, the extreme idea that you go to, that's the reality of Paddock as a player, is he is going to flip every single game by stepping so far forward and trading his life 1 for 2 and hoping and praying that his team can win the team fight after that. And it's a crazy experience to try and deal with. When he came up through the DRX system and got to play for them in the LCK a couple of years ago, I think he replaced Doctum on that team, he was just a sight to behold, because every game was either won or lost by Paddock. Like, there was no middle ground. And when he got a small chance to play for KT Rolster last year, once again coming in for Doctum, he once again was a very flippy player, and there was just no consistency. The mechanics on this guy are ridiculous. There is no brain, and I am long past the point of believing that he's ever going to develop one. Like, he is never going to be a player that accurately judges whether or not a fight should take place. He will take every fight in the entire world. Like, there is no fight on the Rift that he is not willing to at least try and take, and sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. We've seen combos like this work out. We've also seen them not work out, but I really like Trimby as a pairing here because he can be, you know, and I've used this example for a duo like Diablo and Kellen over in the LCK. He can be kind of the person who fires the glass cannon, if you will, Trimby, that is, because Paddock is going to, you know, have a lot of resources generated for him by how good Trimby is in the 2v2, and if you can get a lot of gold on a Paddock, maybe you can just steamroll games, and all of a sudden you have one of the best bot lanes in the entire league. I also think it's equally as possible that no early lead is safe with shifters, and that they're capable of throwing basically any game that they're in, because that's just kind of the Paddock nature. And I also think you have a jungler here who's not really known for generating his own resources or resources for his laners right now with Bukata, so this is a team that I just have a hard time coming to a strong opinion on. I just really like a couple players here. I think Rooster, Nuke, Trimby, I think those three I feel pretty good about, especially Rooster and Trimby. I think are both coming off of, you know, what you wanted to see, solid years, and I think they're smart enough players to be able to affect the game. If you get an awesome year out of Paddock, or if Nuke can get back to that like pseudo MVP kind of performance, or, you know, alternatively, if Bukata actually does take that leap forward and the bot lane turns out to be good, all of a sudden shifters are pretty clearly the 5th best team. I think for me, they're the team that I'm most willing to punt on being the 5th best, and whether they turn out to be or not, whether this team once again underperforms and goes towards the bottom of the standings and we see some roster changes as we go throughout the year, or whether or not Trimby coming back to the LEC and a full year of players like Rooster and Paddock on this roster turn into something positive, you know, whatever it ends up being, I'm really excited to see this new org and this new branding in the LEC and see what happens on what is likely the last chance for this coaching staff and for this version of this roster. Then moving on to number 4 in my power rankings, and I'll be super real with you guys, I don't know if there's ever been a more obvious number 4 in the history of this channel in terms of these power rankings, because the big 3 I think are all, you know, the big 3. They're the 3 teams I would expect to be the best in the league, and then everybody else has major problems. This is a team that I think will be competitive, but is so clearly number 4. It's Fnatic, who's going through a bit of a rebuild, finally, right now. I applauded them quite heavily in my offseason grades video because I really like the decisions that they are making as an organization. It really does feel like they're finally moving into a new chapter. Razork is still a part of the program, which is fine. I don't have anything super against Razork. I've been so excited for this team to finally start its new chapter that isn't just the Razork humanoid era, that, you know, bringing in 2, you know, very high upside players here in Imperos and Lospa down in the support position gives me a lot of hope and confidence, I guess, that Fnatic really is trying their best to carve a new era where they can develop some players into some actual world-class talents. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Imperos in the top lane, Razork in the jungle, Vladi in the mid lane, Upset at AD carry, and Lospa at support. The main piece, obviously, that you're retaining here is Razork. It didn't always look like that was going to be the case for Fnatic this offseason. I was very much, like, pro them moving on from Razork in the jungle. They move on from Humanoid midway through last year, and they, you know, they're better off for it. Let's just say it like it is. They go to Poby, and everything ends up working out a little bit better for the team. They needed a new voice. They needed a new playstyle in the building, and I think Poby gave them that. Not to say that Poby was perfect or that he is a perfect player, but rather I think change was needed in this Fnatic team, and Razork, to me, was a part of that change that probably was a bit needed for Fnatic. They end up retaining him. They want to shop him around all offseason long. At times, it looks like he's going to GIANTX in a trade for Jun, but GX don't want to do that deal. They would would rather have Jun than Lospa. Not that I'm super against that idea. I think both supports are incredibly good, and GX would have ended up with whichever one Fnatic did not end up going for. There was also reported trades to teams like Team Heretics that would have potentially gotten them Sheo, but at the end of the day, they end up sticking with Razork, and I'm perfectly fine with this, right? He's become the franchise player for Fnatic here. He's just a very particular player. He is the embodiment of what I consider like the modern jungler in League of Legends, this kind of archetype of player that has become so pervasive over the past, I would say 3 or 4 years in particular, but really going back like 6 or 7 years, this has become the predominant, jungle archetype, and nobody embodies it better than Razork, which is the snowball jungler, as I like to call it. The player that if you can get him a lead in the early game, he can really take over in the mid to late game. He does really well from ahead. He's very aggressive in terms of being able to control the map when he has the resources, but is quite often very useless if he has to play from a losing state, if his laners aren't in a great spot, and if he's not allowed to play aggressive, or alternatively, if he just loses an early fight, or, an early invade ends up going wrong, then he can be relatively useless, right? It's this feast or famine style that I think has become the most common way to play jungle in the modern era, and Razork, I think, is, again, probably the most emblematic of how that playstyle ends up working. There have been splits where he's been not only MVP candidate, but like an MVP frontrunner at times. He has been somebody that has really pushed this Fnatic team forward, but the problem is, game in, game out, do you know what you're going to get out of Razork? The answer to that has eternally been no. It's just who he is as a player. He is always going to offer you a bit of risk with the playstyle that he does employ. He still is incredibly effective, but to me, he's kind of outside of that big three right now. I think the 3 best junglers in the league were all better than Razork last year, and to me, he falls down to number 4. I think on any given day, he can play like the number 1 jungler. Hell, even over the course of an entire split, he can perform like the number 1 jungler. It's just tough to imagine him doing that over the course of an entire year, because it's really just not been there, and it's not gotten better. The consistency is just not something that we've ever seen improved on Fnatic. So still like Razork, and it's not a playstyle thing. He can do it on carries, he can do it on enchanters like Ivern or whatever that he's very popular for. He can do it on the engaged tanks. He doesn't have like a specific, champion pool limitation or playstyle limitation. He just needs to snowball games. He needs to feel comfortable to go into the late game playing aggressive, and if he can do that, he can still be very effective. You're also retaining Upset from last year. We'll talk about him in a second because I want to get to Vladi first. This is an interesting conversation to have because so much of the Vladi conversation is revolving around things that we don't have real answers to. I think that's the best way I can possibly put it. So much of what people have talked about with that guy over the course of 2025 has centered around, is he a bad teammate? Is he super toxic? Is he impossible to work with? And I'm going to be super for real with you guys. I can't answer that, and neither can any of you. Unless you are people who work for K Corp, you cannot tell me whether Vladi is actually as toxic as everybody makes him out to be. There's just no way for us to actively be able to make that call. And I know it's been a big conversation of like, do you want that kind of player coming in? Is he selfish? Is he going to be too much of a main character on this team? What I saw from Vladi, especially as a rookie, but at the beginning of last year when K Corp was really clicking, when they go to first stand and they win the LEC, when it feels like everything is, working out in the summer or the spring split regular season, what I see from Vladi is a very unselfish mid laner who is very willing to shove and roam. In fact, that is his preferred playstyle from my perspective. Somebody who is happy to move around the map and affect the game by skirmishing all the time. The player I compared him to that people really didn't like the comparison to was Larson. And from a playstyle perspective, I think it's actually kind of apt. And I'm talking like peak Larson. I'm talking LEC winning rogue Larson. That player, I think Vladi actually compares relatively favorably in that conversation. Like, I really do believe he is somebody that can be a cog, especially on a more aggressive team. And with someone like Razork in the jungle, I could see that as a perfect playstyle fit. It's not like Humanoid, who kind of needed to generate his own resources in lane, or he kind of just needed to be isolated 1v1 so that he could use his mechanical advantage to start generating resources while Razork got his own elsewhere on the map. Vladi is the kind of shove and roam mid laner that I think really could be effective in this current meta. But again, there's so many major question marks. There is a reason that this guy is not starting for K Corp in 2026, and that's because of all of these reported offseason rumors. For now, all I can do is judge and grade him based off of what we see on tape, on the Rift, the gameplay that I see with my own eyes, because I'm not in the building. I can't talk about the off the Rift stuff. And he is a top 3 mid laner in the LEC off the eye test. He is somebody that can elevate your team to world's caliber, and I think he could be getting better, and I think that's the biggest, exciting factor here for Fnatic, if it's true, is I think Razork and Vladi, from a playstyle perspective, are a near perfect fit, because Razork can take a lot more of the resources, and they can really start to snowball games if they can open up the map. And that's really only exacerbated by the fact that I think this bot lane's going to be really good this year. I am very high on Upset. As you guys know, he's coming in as my number 280 carry. does seem like people have soured on him in the offseason, as tends to happen with AD carries. It's very funny that during the season, all I was getting was like, how dare you rank Kalist as one of the better AD carries in the league? It's clearly Upset, and then we get to the offseason, and it's like, how dare you rank Upset as an A-? This guy's barely any good. He's carried by Mickey X. Like, it's just so funny to see the polarizing, the black and white opinions of the community, as I talked about earlier. It feels like nobody can really have a gray take on Upset. Generally, I think he is perfect for the role that he plays, which is like the optimized version of someone like Ice that we talked about earlier, where he's not always going to be the main character. His mechanics are very good, and if you leave him isolated in a 2v2, he can generate leads on his own, but he is mostly going to be a player that wants to play within structure and within the rest of the team. The rest of the team is generating resources. He's going to look phenomenal in that environment. If they're not, he's oftentimes going to look a little bit lost and certainly a bit disconnected from the rest of the team. I think Fnatic around him looks good. I think Upset mechanically is arguably the best AD carry in the entire region, so you feel pretty good about having him on this team. I think that, like I said, he is a little bit more, situation dependent than maybe other AD carries are in the league, even players that are below him on these rankings, but I just trust Upset, and there was a clear big two in terms of AD carries last year. Quite frankly, it wasn't particularly close. The two best ADCs in the league were Kalist and Upset, and to me, I have to rank them as such, at least for now, going into 2026. But the reason I'm excited for the bot lane is Lospa in the support position. I think this guy's really interesting to watch. He's been a really fun follow over the past couple of years. He's played with a lot of really interesting players. This guy started off in the Gen G system, getting to play with Quid and Pays on those Gen G Academy teams way back in the day, and then obviously comes over here to Tier 2 and ends up in the GIANTX system where he performs really well last year. This is a really fun support player, and I think he's one of the better rookies in this class of any position. Again, support's just a really hard position to try to break into right now, so he only ranks as number 10, but I would imagine this is pretty clearly going to be like a top 5-ish bot lane in the LEC, and that Lospa by spring or by the summer version of this video is probably going to be closer to top 5 and like in that conversation. I just, he's got the skill set necessary to really be able to take over this league, and I think Fnatic made a really smart choice by bringing him on. From a playstyle perspective, he can do a little bit of everything, but he is a pretty dynamic playmaker, and he's happy to, open up the map. He's also a very good 2v2 player. We just talked about that with Trimby on Shifters. Lospa also kind of in that mold where he can really generate resources effectively, and I think Upset could be in for a really big year if Lospa is as good in lane as he was in Tier 2 and even going back to his time in Korea. So excited for him to come on. I think obviously it's basically impossible to replace Mickey X, but they did about as good as they could, especially because they are entering this like pseudo rebuild phase of theirs. And then there's Imperos on the top side, and this isn't like an upgrade in the same kind of way that I think you are getting in a couple of other players here, because Oscar mechanically is probably more talented than Imperos, but man, I have been begging for Fnatic to pick up a player like this in the top lane for years, because I think with the build that they've had recently, especially when they were trying to build around Razork Humanoid as like a duo and bringing in players like Upset to make that work, what you needed was a top laner that could play resource free, that could be really stable, and that could play tanks and play weak side and just be a good team fighter. That's what they've needed for so long, and Oscar Rinnan, for all of his strengths, because I do think he has quite a few strengths, is a very flippy player who can have some really bad games, is basically never going to play it entirely safe, and that was always a bit of a detriment to Fnatic in these major moments. It's what kind of kept them out of being able to win the LEC. Imperos might not have the same kind of mechanical upside or even aggression, although I think mechanically they're decently similar. He's just much more stable. He doesn't take nearly as many risks. He's a good weak side player, and I think from a stylistic, like playstyle perspective, that is exactly what Fnatic has needed on the top side for a very, very long time. I've really liked this offseason for them. I think the rookies that they chose are really good for this team. Bringing Vladi in, being the team that gives him a chance to be the next humanoid for this team, and hopefully even better than that, because I think he can be better than that, especially from a game impact perspective. And then hoping that Razork and Upset can get back into their top 1 in their roles type of performances that they've had in the past. Like, Fnatic has some real upside here, but clearly out of the top tier teams, they are the lowest floor. Like, there's no way to really argue that. Imperos could be a player that really struggles in lane because he's not exactly the most dominant 1v1 player. I wouldn't even say he's all that dissimilar to someone like Lot, who he ranks 1 spot below. Like, there's a chance he's just kind of a below average top laner from day number 1, which wouldn't be ideal. Lospa's also a bit of a risk, and there's a chance that Upset and Lospa don't work as a duo, that Vladi regresses, that Razork flips too many games. Like, there are just more question marks for Fnatic than there are for any of the other top 3 teams, but they have to be considered top 4 because of the sheer amount of talent on this roster. Like, there is a clear talent upgrade from the top 4 and everybody else in the LEC, and Fnatic deserves to be considered in, at the very least, the conversation for that upper echelon based purely off of that alone. But then moving on to number 3 in my power rankings, and it's a team I really wish I could rank higher, but the big two right now are just looking a little too strong. It's Movistar KOI that I think a lot of people are going to have at number 3, and I also have them at number 3. This is a good team. They've obviously proven that over the past 2 years now of most of this roster being together. Jojo Pune really came in and elevated what their ceiling could look like, though, and I think that they performed a lot better last year than they will ever get credit for. I don't think they're ever going to be looked at as big dogs in the LEC from what they did in 2025, or at least that doesn't really seem to be the narrative for Movistar KOI coming out of 2025, but I think it should be. This team won spring. They ended up finishing top 2 in terms of summer and going as a top 2 seed, and they were one series away where they played T1 from making it out of the Swiss stage at the World Championships. While they were definitely the weakest team in that 2-2 stage, it's still a pretty big accomplishment for them to have had such a good year for, quite frankly, an org that has never really had that level of success before. So let's go ahead and talk about how they project going into 2026. Their lineup is still looking like Mirwin in the top lane, Elyoya in the jungle, Jojo Pune in the mid lane, Supa at AD carry, and Alvaro at support. This is a pretty easy overview to get done for this team because I really haven't changed my thoughts all that much from last year. I think they're a pretty similar team, and I think they're going to play a very specific way. Now, I received some criticism that I think was unjustified throughout a lot of last year for calling out that Movistar KOI really had one playstyle as a unit where they looked competitive, and that was making sure Jojo Pune could be aggressive and move around the map. I got some criticism that, like, oh, you're saying that Elyoya is bad and that Supa and Alvaro are bad, and I'm like, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. I think these guys are excellent. I just think this team is clearly indexed into feeling comfortable with a particular game state. I'll just kind of say it like that. I think when Jojo is winning, all of a sudden, all of the problems and all of the advantages that, you know, Movistar KOI is able to generate for themselves, they all, you know, grow. Like, it becomes so much easier, the problems start to disappear, and just the game becomes a lot more straightforward for how they want to close it out. Their macro becomes very clinical in the later part of the game, even if Jojo Pune's kind of running it down inside lanes like he's, you know, known to do at times. Like, it just feels like the team is more comfortable, even when the rest of the team is playing well. If Jojo Pune is not, like, doing well, if he's not up in gold, or if he's lost lane in the mid lane, this team doesn't have as clear of a macro presence on the map, and I'm not quite sure if that's just because they don't really understand how to play side lanes when they don't have Jojo being able to answer them as effectively, or if they're just not as comfortable with, you know, being able to open up the map in the mid game if they can't do it specifically around one particular lane. We know a lot of teams can kind of get stuck in a style, but it was very much something that popped off on tape for me, where Supa and Alvaro and Elyoya and even Mirwin at times, and we'll talk about him, like, all of them were generating leads on their own. It's not like Jojo was the only player propping this up. Elyoya had a great year. Supa and Alvaro are a bot lane that I've always really liked on this channel, and they're all good enough to be able to get their own resources, but they just didn't amount to as much if Jojo wasn't the one actually, like, being the centralizing force for where a lot of those resources were going. So I still think Jojo is the main character of what Movistar KOI is doing, but he proved internationally that he has the talent, he has the mentality to be able to go up against the best mid laners in the world consistently and make it work. So I still feel very good about Jojo, and I think he is kind of the guy to watch here. He's the number 2 mid laner in the league for me. I think his stock has only elevated over the course of the past year, and he has been everything that this org wanted him to be when they imported him from North America. Of course, you do want to talk about Elyoya second. He is my number 2 jungler in the league. Some people might even have him at number 1, and I can't really push back all that much on that. I think number 1 will surprise a lot of people, especially those who have not been around my channel as of late, but for me, Elyoya is, like, right up there for being the best jungler in the league. This was a guy I perennially had at number 1 in these rankings from, like, 2023 through 2024, like 5 or so splits in a row, 6 or so splits in a row. I don't think I ever took this guy out of the number 1 spot for jungle, even when he was on some up and down Mad Lions teams. It just always really felt like he was able to make it work, no matter what situation, no matter what his mid lane situation looked like, no matter what the rest of the team looked like. He was always able to push the game forward. He's very versatile as a player. Definitely somebody who I think prefers to be more of a carry, but can facilitate. I just think that in big moments, you can see him default to some more aggressive tendencies, which I think is fine. I would rather a player default to aggressive tendencies rather than default to passive ones, which we'll talk about with the player that comes in below Elyoya at number 3 on this list in just a moment. But love Elyoya. I think him and Jojo had pretty good chemistry together. I think they could even still improve upon it. We saw that towards the end of the year, that the team really started to play better around Jojo, and I think that that could only get better with time. And I think if they can improve on that kind of synergy and chemistry we saw out of the mid jungle last year, that's going to be really, really positive for KOI. And then you have Supa and Alvaro, and I love this bot lane. I've always been a big defender of both of these guys. I've gave Supa my Rookie of the Year in 2024 over Jackie's, because as I will continuously remind people, Rookie of the Year has the word year in it. Like, I think that's that's the most important part of that award because as it turns out, Rookie of the Year with LEC voters just means Rookie of the Summer Split, as it would turn out, and not much else really has ended up mattering for them. But jokes aside, like, Supa's really good. He's just a very, very solid ADC. He definitely has a particular playstyle in that he does want to snowball games. He wants to generate leads in the early game so that he can be more aggressive in the later part, but like, I don't hate the deft call out that he made as a rookie. I honestly don't think they play all that dissimilarly to each other. I think both of them have a knack for playing weak side if they need to, but really are kind of like focal point pieces for maybe who you want to play through. And Supa's been a great big game performer for KOI domestically. Obviously, there have been some times internationally where he's looked a bit outclassed, but that's just generally the case for the West. Like, I hate to just kind of narrow it down like that, but there are very few Western players that are consistently going to be able to go up against the best bot lanes in the world and like actually deal with them, especially because it's not just an AD carry gap. But Supa domestically has been a huge, huge reason why KOI has had a lot of success in the playoffs. So you feel good about him. I would say you feel even better about Alvaro as a playmaker. I said this in the offseason grades video, but for those of you who aren't as familiar with Alvaro or maybe haven't heard me talk about him before, Alvaro is one of the most unique supports in the entire world because he's really the only one that I can actively point to, especially of players that I would consider to be near the top of their region or, you know, high-end performers. He's really the only support in the world that I actually think is better playing from behind than he is playing from ahead. I've never seen a support with that kind of skill set where if he's like up in gold, it's good and he's able to generate resources, but most of the time Elyoya is the one running a lot of the playmaking duties and Supa and Jojo are doing a lot of the carrying in the games where they already have a gold lead. If they're at a gold deficit, Alvaro will find the most unbelievable engage you've ever seen in your entire life, and it's super consistent for him. Some part of his brain just activates when he is down in gold. It's really funny to see that playmaking instinct kind of come online. There's a little bit of Crisp in that. I think that's probably the player that it's the most comparable to. Like, I'm talking prime Crisp, world champion Crisp in 2019, like that version of that player. Alvaro probably most similarly compares to him. I don't know if he necessarily has the same playmaking instincts ahead, because Crisp was always just ridiculously dangerous at finding those engage angles, but Alvaro is just a menace when his team needs a miracle play to get back into the game. He's just better at that than anybody else in the world. That includes every LCK and LPL support. He is the best at that specific skill set. Unfortunately, I wish he was more consistent in other phases of the game. Specifically, his laning needs to improve. It's always been his biggest weakness, and we saw that exploited internationally last year. Hopefully that does get a little bit better for him. Finally, there's Mirwin on the top side. Mirwin had a better second year than he did rookie year. I think from all accounts, he made some major strides. I think we had a lot of criticisms of Mirwin on this channel in year number 1 back in 2024 because he really was like, either I get a weird counter pick like Vex or Varus or I will lose the game. Like, there was no middle ground. He could only play off meta picks, and I genuinely thought he was one of the least valuable top laners in the entire league. That champion pool isn't huge, but it definitely expanded. The Cassante got better, the Mbessa got better, and I think those are two pretty important champions to be able to spam in the current meta. So Mirwin, I still feel okay about. He's going to rise all the way up to being my number 5 top laner. That's about as high as he's probably ever going to be able to get just because he has a naturally limited skill set. He is not a good player at playing weak side, and he really isn't good at stalling games out, but he's talented. He can get into good positions. He's just pretty feast or famine on the top side of the map, which makes it difficult to try to evaluate him. But again, he got better over the course of last year. Theoretically, there could be another jump in there on the top side. I still like KOI, and they're the same team that they were last year. I would expect them to perform almost identically to how they performed last year in terms of, you know, production and how the team ends up playing out. I just worry that the league around them got a little bit better. Specifically, you know, we'll talk about it, the team, you know, the two teams above them I think are just too strong right now for me to imagine that KOI is going to consistently be in that same kind of conversation. But who knows? Any one miracle split can happen. One of these teams is likely going to underperform. It just happens in the LEC every single year, and Movistar KOI is almost certainly going to be there to capitalize when one of them does. But that's going to bring us to number 2 in my power rankings, and this is where it always gets spicy. This is where it always gets controversial, and that is no different this split, because coming in at number 2 for me, it is the defending LEC champions and the team that is coming off a quarterfinals appearance at the World Championships. It's G2 Esports coming in at number 2, and I know this is not going to make people happy. I always take risks in these LEC videos. I don't know why. It just always ends up, you know, all of these teams I think are a lot closer in the LEC than they are in other regions where it's a lot easier to tell, like, the difference in skill level between certain tiers of teams, whereas here, I think in the LEC, there are a bunch of teams that could theoretically be pretty high up there, could go in a lot of different orders, and you know what? I truly do believe that G2 on paper is the second best team in the LEC, but a lot of that comes from the fact that I'm lower lower on bot lane, and I'm still probably a little bit lower on jungle than I think general consensus, even if I have kind of come around that he has been, very valuable towards this team. So let's talk about it, man, because there are already some things that I'm sure are lighting up the engagement comment section of this video if the Los Ratones ranking already didn't do that. Their lineup is looking like Broken Blade in the top lane, Skumond in the jungle, Caps in the mid lane, Hans Sama at AD carry, and Labrov at support. Let's get the Hans Sama conversation out of the way first, because man, I just have to have it every single video, huh? I was joking about this, but I owe so much to Hans. He keeps my engagement in the comment section up every single video that I post in the offseason, because I'm constantly ranking this guy like 4th in terms of LEC AD carries, and people are constantly telling me that I'm a moron and that my entire opinion in this entire video is completely invalidated because of that. But I'm gonna be honest, man, I'm going to stick to my guns. If you guys respect me for anything, respect me for the idea that I'm not giving up, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not just going to change my opinion because others have it. I've gone back and rewatched more Hans Sama tape than almost any other player I have ever evaluated, because every single time I make a ranking or post like a grade of, G2 or just generally like Hans Sama, even going back to his time in North America or on Rogue or on Misfits back in the day, I've always just been a little bit lower on what Hans actually offers. And every time I watch tape, I come to the same conclusion. This guy is good. He is very good at his job, and he's also not great. Like, he just doesn't have the great mechanics that you would need. He's a decently limited skill set, and quite frankly, I don't think he fits well on this team. I think fit has always been a problem. Now, Hans kind of did the reverse trajectory to what he normally does last year. Hans, I would typically throughout his career describe as a massive performer in domestic playoffs, somebody who almost always comes up clutch, especially in like spring or winter or early season playoffs. He's almost always dominant in those and is able to carry his teams to, early major international tournaments. He's even done that in the summer playoffs as well, decently consistently, but he's always been a Worlds underperformer, especially since he left Misfits and went to Rogue back in the day. He's always been somebody that I think really struggled to be able to maintain consistent form internationally, and I'm going to continue to say what I said about him last year. I want people to go and rewatch MSI, because it just feels like we watched a different tournament. He was the single worst player at MSI, and I know a lot of hate goes to Broken Blade, and it goes to Labrov for how this team played at the midseason invitational. I implore you guys to, instead of looking at the box score, look at the team fights, because this guy's positioning was the worst I've ever seen in my entire life. This guy completely threw things away, and I'm like, oh no, Hans is collapsing earlier than normal this year, and then he plays well again domestically in the playoffs, and then poof, he's good at Worlds. What? That doesn't normally happen with Hans Sama. I was really surprised by that. Pleasantly surprised, of course, but he was really valuable towards this team's quarterfinals run at the World Championships, and you just kind of have to hope that that's something that he's turning around, because generally speaking, this guy has just been fine and above average, like a good AD carry for most of his career. Not somebody that's ever really been a #1 option, especially on G2, but somebody that you feel good about, and then he gets to Worlds and collapses. If he's going to be more consistent than that, then yeah, he starts to get more in the conversation. But if you're screaming at me for putting Supa or Kalist or Upset above Hans Sama, I'm sorry, we just disagree about the player, and it is what it is. I understand that I seem to really disagree with a lot of the community, but I do think he is #4. I think he's probably closer to being where I grade Noah than he is to being where I grade, like, Upset or Kalist from last year, and it's just the way that I feel. If you have a different opinion, let me know in the comment section. If it invalidates the whole video for you, again, I understand you would be far from the first person to say that, but it's just my opinion. And the same thing for Labrov. I think a lot of people forget just how awful he was for most of last year, because he was so good at Worlds and at the end of the year, and it really felt like he turned it around. But the big worry that I had for G2, and you can check this out from the winter primer last year in 2025, the big concern I had for G2 was, man, Hans Sama really loves to be like a 2v2 dominant ADC that generates resources early. He's an early game focused AD carry player. He's the Caitlyn, Kalista, Draven guy, right? Like, he wants to be lane dominant, and Labrov, like, when you think of his skill set and what made him one of the best supports in the LEC on BDS, and even at times on Vitality before that, it was the fact that he was the best support team fighter in the entire region. He was somebody who was super consistent in the 5v5s of being that frontline setup that could engage and really facilitate an AD carry to pop off in the 5v5s. It's what he did for Ice when that team ended up making Worlds. It's what he did for Crownie when he was playing with him on BDS. So it was just one of those things where I was so worried about the playstyle fit, and it completely came to fruition. These two looked like they were on completely different planets when they were playing together throughout a majority of the previous year. Labrov, ironically enough, fits the skill set of someone like Skumond a lot more, even someone like Caps, who I think prefers a little bit of a slower style. But Hans and Labrov just never got on the same page until the end of the year, when they realized, like, who cares if we're on the same page? Labrov, just go do something else on the map, and Hans will just survive in the 2v1 because he is a good laner that you can kind of reliably, keep him on weak side and and actually have him perform well, and he's a great mid-game skirmisher, and so they just ended up playing a little bit more for that. I think Skumon settling in ended up really helping that a lot, but yeah, they played better towards the end of the year. I still don't trust them more than the other players that I have ranked above them. LeBron for me comes in as the number 6 support. He was not good for a majority of last year, not just like average. He was below average for a majority of 2025, and while he seemed to figure things out towards the end of the split, I still have playstyle concerns, and I don't really think that the support position got weaker by any means. He comes in below Trimby. I do think Trimby is a better player. I think he has more tools, and I certainly think he would fit better on this G2 team. Not that that really matters for my ranking calculation, but like that's where LeBron is. Like support is a stacked role. He's not coming in the top 4. He's nowhere near that conversation for me in terms of the consistency that he's shown, and so it's him at 5 or Trimby at 5, and I settled on Trimby, who I thought played better last year. So that's the argument for the bot lane, and that's most of the negativity that I will say about G2, although I'll bring up some negativity about both of the topside members here. Skumon is probably the other player that people are upset by in terms of these rankings. He comes in as my number 3 jungler. I think this is an overly fair ranking. Like, I don't know, maybe I'm just like not on the same page as everybody else when it comes to G2, but Skumon is a very good player at the things he's good at. Again, he's just relatively specialized, and while he is growing outside of that mold, this is a guy who really, for most of last year, could only perform if he was playing Maokai or some champion that just did not need to skirmish a lot in the early game, because he just never really figured it out domestically how to skirmish aggressively. He got much better at that at Worlds, and again, that is a big theme for G2, is I think they played better at Worlds than they did at any point in the LEC previously. Even when they were dominating and went 8-0 and won the summer split, I still think they showed more at the World Championships than they did domestically, and if that is the version that you are expecting over the course of this year, then they have a strong case to be number 1. I just need to see a little bit more in terms of the tape. If Skumon can continue to speed up his game and be more aggressive at just being willing to skirmish, or God forbid actually winning the skirmishes, because he didn't always do that either, then I think he's going to skyrocket to being one of the best junglers in the league. I think he has the luxury of having a really nice situation around him, but I do think a lot of his success last year was very situation dependent, and it only really started happening when the team basically just said we have to play for Skumon towards the end of the year, which I think is fine. This team is more than set up to be able to do that, but he is a decently particular player. And then there's Broken Blade, which is a really difficult conversation to have, because he's clearly a top 2 top laner in the LEC just off of resume alone. I mean, he's Broken Blade, right? Like, he's been one of the best top laners in the league since he joined G2. Not so much before that. I continue to be on the train that, Schalke and TSM Broken Blade were decently overrated, but he evolved his game a ton when he came over to G2. He got much better at playing weak side and really became a much more well-rounded player. The G2 system just kind of does that for a lot of players, but last year was easily his worst year on G2. Had a lot of inconsistencies domestically, even had some problems internationally. MSI was another example of just like a tournament where he was not good and was not particularly locked in. You just have to hope it's a bit of an outlier. Again, it's one of those things where there aren't really a lot of top laners that right now have the floor to kind of take his spot in these rankings. He's certainly not number 1 in terms of expectation coming into this year, but number 2 I think is fine, and I think if he had a rebound year and was the number 1 top laner, I don't think anybody would really be all that surprised. It's Broken Blade on the top side. You have to hope that he's going to be an elite caliber player again. And then finally, we have Caps in the mid lane, and this is the easiest conversation to have. It's why I saved it for last. He's still the best player in the LEC. Like, he just is. He's super valuable to this team. He creates so much because he doesn't need any resources to be up a ton of gold in the mid lane, and he's the most proactive mid to late game player in the entire region. I was really thinking about this the most in the offseason, but like, Caps was always called like Baby Faker in a lot of, worlds coming up when he was on Fnatic. Like, that was just kind of a nickname that people gave Caps because he kind of was the Faker of the West, and he still is like the most accomplished Western player of all time. I really sat down and was like, man, that is like such an apt comparison. Like, Caps and Faker have very similar play styles in the way that they like to play the game. I think Caps is more mechanically talented in comparison to his peers. Obviously, Faker is ridiculously mechanically talented. If Faker played in the LEC, it would be a different story, but like, in comparison to the talent he's playing against regularly, Caps, I think, outshines his competition more, but I think they both win in very similar ways, and I think they both make mistakes in similar ways, where there can just be some mid-game moments where they trust themselves a little too much to be able to make some plays, but generally, they're very smart players that play the map well and are almost always in the right place. It's, Caps is Caps. Like, there's not much I can describe there. He is what elevates this team to bare minimum being number 2, and like, when you have a player like Caps that's an A+, that, is the best player in the region, you're going to be like a favorite to win the league, basically no matter what. I have this team at number 2, but even with all of the negatives that I said about the bot lane, and even about how I want to see more out of Skumon and Broken Blade, Caps alone would elevate this team team to number 1 throughout most of my power rankings if this team showed up in week number 1 and just started dominating. That's just the way it goes with G2 Esports. So as uncomfortable as I feel, talking about the fact that I think the bot lane's overrated, and I think the top side kind of needs to show they can be better than last year with an improved team around them. Caps just rights all wrongs, man. This guy just makes everything right, and I think G2 as an org have proven that they just figure out situations. They are able to adapt, and they're able to get better throughout, the year. They get better as the year goes along. They proved last year that they did not want to walk out of a single year titleless. It's been quite a long time since they did that, and honestly, even with them coming in number 2 in these rankings, I would be stunned if they walked out of 2026 with that, at the very least, 1 title. But that's going to bring us to my number 1 team in my power rankings, and by process of elimination, you know who it is, and to me, it's clear who the favorite should be heading into this year. It's K Corp. It's K Corp coming in at number 1, just as they did in my summer split power rankings, despite the fact that turned out to be folly, that turned out to be illusion. It turned out to be hopeless faith that ended up not getting paid back out to me for a team that ended up missing Worlds, getting 4th place, and disappointing. Well, they have stacked their lineup so that they do not do that again. A couple of major changes in the mid lane and in support that I think have made this team a lot more interesting, and to me, they were already on paper favorites last year in terms of the roster that they had. I think if they're not dominating the LEC this year, if they're not a team that's consistently near the top of the standings and competing right up there with G2, this is a wasted season with the amount of talent that they have brought in here, and I'll kind of talk about why. Their lineup is looking like Kana in the top lane, Yike in the jungle, Yehu in the mid lane, Kalista AD carry, and Busio at support. Number 1s across the board except for mid lane, which is definitely a little bit lower in this conversation, all the way down at number 7 for Yehu. I'll talk about why, as somebody who covers the LCK every single game, I'm a little bit lower on the Yehu signing than maybe some other analysts are, and why I think a lot of his strengths aren't necessarily suited to this particular K-Corp team, unless I'm just entirely wrong. But let's get the elephant out of the room first. There are a couple of number 1s on here that I think people are going to contest. The Yike one I think is probably going to be the most controversial. I still think Yike is the best jungler in the league from a process perspective. I think that the way he looks at the game is the most translatable to any situation. I think he had a situation that was a little bit more rough, and he was a part of why it was rough last year. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that he was perfect, but he's absolutely, undoubtedly the most mechanically talented jungler in the entire league. I don't think there's really any argument for that. And I think there's no jungler that consistently is able to generate their own leads in the same kind of way that Yike is able to do. So for me, he still comes in at number 1. I really like Yike on this team, especially now that you're adding someone like Yehu, who I'll talk about him last because I want to go a bit in depth on him. But if you want the TLDR on it, he is a good mid laner, but his strengths are shot calling and macro from what we've seen throughout the LCK, and also stabilizing in the mid lane. Not so much shoving and roaming, but not really being like a problem, just going neutral in lane. And I think that that's fine for this team, and if you're looking for a positive, it's that Yehu doesn't need resources, so Yike might get more resources this year, as opposed to maybe what this team had with Vladi. Hopefully, you have a better locker room situation as well, considering everything that people are talking about. And then I think generally, people are going to argue the bot lane rankings both being number 1 here. There should be no argument for Busio, quite frankly. Like, I don't think there is an argument that Busio is anything other than the number 1 support from last year. This guy has not only just grown and grown every single year, the delight, thing that I talk about, the delight graph that I always mention, where if a player just gets better every single time you watch them, can you not just continue to expect that moving forward? But also, he was better than any LEC support last year, and you can say that that's Cope from like an NA guy, because I do live in America. You can hear that from my accent. It's not Cope, man. I promise. Like, I'm being as objective as I possibly can. Busio is a menace. There is a reason K-Corp went out and got him. This guy was my MVP of the LCS, or the LTA North, last year. Over Inspired. I really think he was that good for FlyQuest and that important towards their domestic success. This guy's nuts. He's Carrier light. Like, all of the comparisons that have been made in the offseason, they're absolutely correct. He is Carrier if you tuned him down by, if you brought him to 90 or 85%, right? Like, that is Busio. He is the biggest and best playmaker in the West of any position. Nobody creates nearly as effectively and as easily as he does. He fits the meta perfectly. He was one of the first people in the West to start picking up Nico super consistently last year. The Rakan was perma-banned from him early on in his career, and it's basically been thrown to the wayside. The Bard has become something that's become a signature pick for him now. Like, he has so many different picks that allow him to be this big dynamic playmaker. I think this is just an upgrade for this team. I like Targamas, and I think he played a good role for this team, but Busio is just better at everything compared to Targamas. Like, he is a ridiculous grab for K-Corp, and he is the biggest reason why this team is coming in at number 1 for me in these power rankings. If he plays anything like he did last year, he could win MVP in the LEC. Like, he absolutely has that kind of upside. And then there's Kaliste, and this just comes down to process for me, putting him at number 1, just like I did last split. The best mechanical AD carry for me is the number 1 ADC in the region. Like, you can have a more dynamic skill set, and Kaliste does. Like, he is a good laner, he is a good team fighter, he doesn't really have a phase of the game that he prefers, he can really do whatever the team needs, but if you are, like, the most capable AD carry at being able to generate and capitalize on resources, you're the best AD carry in the region. At that point, it just kind of becomes whether or not you have a circumstance that lets you do it, and Kaliste is the most talented AD carry in the region. He just is. There's nobody that can compete in terms of raw mechanics and raw talent with Kaliste, and I think with Busio as his support, yeah, I expect him to win MVP this year. Like, that is the expectation to me for Kaliste. I was bullish on Kaliste at the beginning of last year, kind of pushing back on this idea that he was going to immediately be a day 1 success. Boy, was I wrong. He immediately came in and was a day 1 success, and I think he will show out in year number 2 here for K Corp as a superstar for this team. And then Kana on the top side, this should be the least arguable number 1 choice. This guy was the best player in the LEC last year, full stop. He sprinted the final series against Oscar Rinnan and kept his team out of the World Championships, and all I have to say to that is, yeah, I had 99% of his games, he completely obliterated everyone he played into. I just have to assume that that was a bit of an outlier. It's not like Kana was a big game underperformer when he was in the LCK, when he was playing for T1 and all these other organizations. Kana has historically been a pretty good performer in the playoffs and in big moments. He just played bad in that one series. I think he will be fine moving forward. And for me, he's not only the best top laner in the region, he's the second best player in the region, only behind Caps. And I think that's a pretty big compliment. Finally, we do have to talk about Yehu. I gave the TLDR earlier, but Yehu's an interesting player. He's gotten very interesting looks on DRX over the course of his career. He almost always comes in as a substitute midway through the year. He's done it multiple times now for that DRX team and like taken the starting spot. He's been fine. He's like a master of going neutral in lane, which is not exactly the best like resource that you can have. You usually see an uptick in production from, laning going from the LCK to the LEC. Teams are just not, or mid laners are just not as good in the laning phase here, so you're able to generate bigger leads, but his strength has never really been his mechanics. It's never even really been his skirmishing and his team fighting, even his shove and roaming. He's a very big vocal leader in the LCK. That is something that you've always heard about Yehu, is that he is one of the most vocal and one of the most like energetic and just energizing players that you could ever have on your team. How does that translate to K Corp? I have no clue. There's a language barrier on this team. I hope that he's going to be able to bring that same positive presence that he's been bringing to DRX and to the LCK for many years, but from a pure like on the Rift perspective, what I can analyze, he's been an average to slightly below average LCK mid laner for about 2.5 years now, and he's not really all that good at one phase of the game. He's kind of slightly average at everything, like average to slightly below average at everything from an LCK perspective. That would make him probably average at everything from an LEC perspective, and that's why he ranks a little bit lower in terms of the floor ranking. I think from a production standpoint, with the roster that he has around him, he's in a great spot to just take over this league and to really realize a lot of his potential, and I think basically any mid laner in this spot could probably perform well, but just from what we've seen so far out of him in the LCK, it would be, I think, wrong of me to rate him higher than this based off the idea that he's playing with good players. We just haven't seen it on tape with Yehu, but I do imagine that he will be able to come into his own throughout this year. I'm just super high on this K Corp roster. It's funny, we bookended this video with K Corp Blue being last and K Corp being first, so hope K Corp fans are okay with that little trade-off that we have there. I just think this team has to be considered the favorites in the LEC, even over G2. They just have too much talent on the roster. If this team is not walking out with multiple championships in the LEC and actual international success this year, there's nothing other than disappointment from that, because that's the kind of level of talent that they brought in here. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC winter split versus split, however you want to call it, primer and power rankings video. All 12 teams done and dusted in a very comprehensive format. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? I know you guys disagree with a ton. I'm sure you've already left a ton of comments down in the comment section below, but it's always fun to hear from you guys down in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button. There's obviously a couple of things that I'm going to plug, but these videos always are, contentious and have some ups and downs. There are some dislikes that get thrown around. It really helps the algorithm to leave a like. I do want to plug at least a little bit at the end of the video if you made it this far. I am going to be a caster for LPL English all year long, as I was last year. You can check out the links for that in the description. The YouTube and the Twitch for LPL English are down there. Highly recommend you follow and subscribe and, go and check out the LPL, not just because I'll be on it. You can hear me talk about League of Legends live as we watch it as a color commentator, but also because everyone who works on that product is fantastic, and the league itself this year looks like a real fun time, and you can see that in my LPL primer video, this version of the video done for the LPL. So highly recommend you check that out. You either follow or subscribe depending on the platform of your choice. And then of course hit subscribe on this channel as well. This is obviously a place where we're going to be covering the LEC all year long. We're covering all 3 of the other major regions as well. So LCS, LCK, and LPL every single game, every single week, as we've done every single year since 2022, the 5th year in a row on this channel that we are going to be doing it. If you are interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all